Love of Lovers by Maxim Gorky. At a small station between Rome and Genoa, the guard opened the door of our compartment and, with the assistance of a dirty oiler, carried almost, a little one-eyed old man up the steps into our midst. "Very old," remarked both at the same time, smiling good-naturedly. But the old man turned out to be very vigorous. After thanking his helpers with a pretty gesture of his wrinkled hand, he politely and gaily lifted his shabby, dust-stained hat from his grey head and, looking sharply at the seats with his one eye, inquired, "Will you permit me?" He was given a seat at once. He then straightened his blue linen suit, heaved a sigh of relief, and, putting his hands on his little withered knees, smiled good-humouredly, disclosing a toothless mouth. "Going far, uncle?" asked my companion. "Only 3 stations," he replied readily. "I'm going to my grandson's wedding." After a few minutes he became very talkative, and, raising his voice above the noise made by the wheels of the train, told us as he swayed this way and that like a broken branch on a windy day. "I'm a Ligurian. We Ligurians are a strong people. I, for instance, have 13 sons and 4 daughters. I confuse my grandchildren in counting them. This is the second one to get married. That's pretty good, don't you think?" He looked proudly round the compartment with his lustreless but still merry eye. Then he laughed quietly and said, "See how many people I have given to my country and to the king." How did I lose my eye? Oh, that was long ago, when I was still a boy, but already helping my father. He was breaking stones in the vineyard. Our soil is very hard and needs a lot of attention. There are a great many stones. A stone flew from underneath my father's pick and hit me in the eye. I don't remember any pain, but at dinner my eye came out. It was terrible, signors. They put it back in its place and applied some warm bread, but the eye died. The old man rubbed his brown skinny cheek and laughed again in a merry, good-humoured way. At that time there were not so many doctors, and people were much more stupid. What? You think they may have been kinder? Perhaps they were. And now this dried-up, one-eyed, deeply wrinkled face, with its partial covering of greenish-grey, mouldy-looking hair, became knowing and triumphant. When one has lived as long as I, one may talk confidently about men, isn't that so? He raised significantly a dark, crooked finger as though threatening someone. "I will tell you, signor, something about people. When my father died, I was 13 at the time. You see how small I am even now? But I was very skillful and could work without getting tired. That is all I inherited from my father. Our house and land were sold for debts. And so with but one eye and 2 hands, I lived on, working wherever I could get work. It was hard, but youth is not afraid of work, is it? When I was 19, I met a girl whom fate had meant me to love. She was as poor as myself, though stronger and more robust. She also lived with her mother, an old woman in failing health, and worked when and where she could. She was not very comely, but kind and clever, and she had a fine voice. Oh, she sang like a professional, and that in itself means riches, signors. "Shall we get married?" said I, after we had known each other for some time. "It would be funny, you one-eyed fellow," she replied rather sadly. "Neither you nor I have anything. What should we live on?" Upon my soul, neither I nor she had anything. But what does that signify to young love? You all know, signors, how little love requires. I was insistent and got my way. "Yes, perhaps you're right," said Ida at last. "If the Holy Mother helps you and me now, when we live apart, it will be much easier for her to help us when we live together." We decided upon it and went to the priest. "This is madness," said the priest. "Aren't there beggars enough in Liguria? Unhappy people, playthings of the devil? You must struggle against his snares, or you will pay dearly for your weakness." All the youths in the commune jeered at us, and all the old people shook their heads, I can tell you. But youth is obstinate and will have its way. The wedding day drew near. We were no better off than we had been before. We really did not know where we should sleep on our wedding night. "Let us go into the fields," said Ida. "Why won't that do?" "The Mother of God is equally kind to all, and love is everywhere equally passionate when people are young." That is what we decided upon, that the earth should be our bed and the sky our coverlet. At this point another story begins, signors. Please pay attention. This is the best story of my long life. Early in the morning of the day before our wedding, the old man Giovanni, for whom I worked, said to me like this, his pipe between his teeth, as if he were speaking about trifles: "Ugo, you had better go and clean out the old sheep shed and put some straw in it. Although it is dry there, and no sheep have been in it for over a year, it ought to be cleaned out properly if you want to live in it with Ida." Thus we had a house. As I worked and sang, the carpenter, Constanzio, stood in the door and asked, "Are you going to live here with Ida? Where's your bed? You must come to me when you have finished and get one from me. I have one to spare." As I went to his house, Mary, the bad-tempered shopkeeper, shouted, "The wretched sillies get married and don't possess a sheet or pillow or anything else. You're quite crazy, you one-eyed fellow. Send your sweetheart to me." And Ettore Viano, tortured by rheumatism and fever, shouted from the threshold of his house, "Ask him whether he has saved up much wine for the guests. Oh, good people, who could be more light-headed than these two?" In a deep wrinkle on the old man's cheek glistened a tear of happiness. He threw back his head and laughed noiselessly, pawing his old throat and the flabby skin of his face. His arms were as restless as a child's. "Ah, signors," said he, laughing and catching his breath. "On our wedding morn we had everything that was wanted for a home. A statue of the Madonna, crockery, linen, furniture, everything, I swear. Ida wept and laughed, and so did I, and everybody laughed. It is not the thing to weep on one's wedding day, and they all laughed at us. Signors, words cannot tell how sweet it is to be able to say 'our people.' It is better still to feel that they are yours, near and dear to you, your kindred, for whom your life is no joking matter, your happiness no plaything." And the wedding took place. It was a great day. The whole commune turned out to see us, and everybody came to our shed, which had become a rich house, as in a fairy tale. We had everything, wine and fruit, meat and bread, and all ate and were merry. There's no greater happiness, signors, than to do good to others. Believe me, there's nothing more beautiful or more joyful. And we had a priest. "These people," he said gravely, and in a manner suited to the occasion, "have worked for you all, and now you have provided for them so that they may be happy on the best day of their life. That is exactly what you should have done, for they have worked for you, and work is of more account than copper and silver coins. Work is always greater than the payment that is given for it. Money disappears, but work remains. These people are happy and humble. Their life has been hard, but they have not grumbled. It may be harder yet, and they will not murmur, and you will help them in an hour of need. Their hands are willing, and their hearts as good as gold." He said a lot of flattering things to me, to Ida, and to the whole commune. The old man looked triumphantly with his one eye at his fellow travellers, and there was something youthful and vigorous in his glance as he said, "There you have something about people, signors. Curious, isn't it?" And of Love of Lovers by Maxim Gorky.
The Box Tunnel by Charles Reade. A fact. The 10:15 train glided from Paddington, May 7th, 1847. In the left compartment of a certain first-class carriage were 4 passengers. Of these, 2 were worth description. The lady had a smooth, white, delicate brow, strongly marked eyebrows, long lashes, eyes that seemed to change colour, and a good-sized, delicious mouth with teeth as white as milk. A man could not see her nose for her eyes and mouth. Her own sex could and would have told us some nonsense about it. She wore an unpretending greyish dress, buttoned to the throat with lozenge-shaped buttons, and a Scotch shawl that agreeably evaded the responsibility of colour. She was like a duck, so tight her plain feathers fitted her, and there she sat, smooth, snug, and delicious, with a book in her hand and a soupçon of her snowy wrist just visible as she held it. Her opposite neighbour was what I call a good style of man, the more to his credit since he belonged to a corporation that frequently turns out the worst imaginable style of young man. He was a cavalry officer, aged 25. He had a moustache, but not a repulsive one, not one of those sub-nasal pigtails on which soup is suspended like dew on a shrub. It was short, thick, and black as coal. His teeth had not as yet been turned by tobacco smoke to the colour of tobacco juice. His clothes did not stick to nor hang on him. They sat on him. He had an engaging smile, and what I liked the dog for, his vanity, which was inordinate, was in its proper place. His heart, not in his face, jostling mine and other people's who have none. In a word, he was what one oftener hears of than meets, a young gentleman. He was conversing in an animated whisper with a companion, a fellow officer. They were talking about what it is far better not to do, women. Our friend clearly did not wish to be overheard, for he cast ever and anon a furtive glance at his fair vis-à-vis and lowered his voice. She seemed completely absorbed in her book, and that reassured him. At last the two soldiers came down to a whisper, and in that whisper, the truth must be told, the one who got down at Slough and was lost to posterity bet £10 to 3 that he, who was going down with us to Bath and immortality, would not kiss either of the ladies opposite upon the road. Done? Done. Now I'm sorry a man I have hitherto praised should have lent himself, even in a whisper, to such a speculation, but nobody is wise at all hours, not even when the clock is striking 25, and you are to consider his profession, his good looks, and the temptation. 10 to 3. After Slough, the party was reduced to 3. At Twyford, one lady dropped her handkerchief. Captain Dolignan fell on it like a tiger and returned it like a lamb. 2 or 3 words were interchanged on that occasion. At Reading, the Marlborough of our tale made one of the safe investments of that day. He bought a Times and a Punch. The latter was full of steel pen thrusts and woodcuts. Valour and Beauty deigned to laugh at some inflated humbug or other punctured by Punch. Now laughing together thaws our human ice. Long before Swindon it was a talking match. At Swindon, who so devoted as Captain Dolignan? He handed them out, he souped them, he tough-chickened them, he branded and cochinealed one. Note, this is supposed to allude to 2 decoctions called port and sherry, and imagined by one earthly nation to partake of a vinous nature. And he branded and burnt-sugared the other. On their return to the carriage, one lady passed into the inner compartment to inspect a certain gentleman's seat on that side the line. Reader, had it been you or I, the beauty would have been the deserter. The average one would have stayed with us till all was blue, ourselves included. Not more surely does our slice of bread and butter, when it escapes from our hand, revolve it ever so often, a light face downwards on the carpet. But this was a bit of a fop, Adonis, a dragoon, so Venus remained in a tete-a-tete with him. You have seen a dog meet an unknown female of his species. How handsome, how empressé, how expressive he becomes. Such was Dolignan after Swindon, and to do the dog justice, he got handsomer and handsomer. And you have seen a cat conscious of approaching cream. Such was Miss Haythorn. She became demurer and demurer. Presently our captain looked out of the window and laughed. This elicited an inquiring look from Miss Haythorn. We are only a mile from the box tunnel. "Do you always laugh a mile from the box tunnel?" said the lady.
"Invariably."
"What for?"
"Why, it's a gentleman's joke."
"Oh, I don't mind it being silly if it makes me laugh." Captain Dolignan, thus encouraged, recounted to Miss Haythorn the following.
A lady and her husband sat together going through the box tunnel. There was one gentleman opposite, and it was pitch dark. After the tunnel, the lady said,
"George, how absurd of you to salute me going through the tunnel."
"I did no such thing."
"You didn't?"
"No. Why?"
"Why, because somehow I thought you did."
Here Captain Dolignan laughed, and endeavoured to lead his companion to laugh, but it was not to be done. The train entered the tunnel.
Miss Haythorn.
"Oh!" Dolignan. "Oh, what's the matter?"
Miss Haythorn. "I'm frightened."
Dolignan, moving to her side. "Oh, pray do not be alarmed. I am near you."
Miss Haythorn. "You are near me. Very near me indeed, Captain Dolignan."
Dolignan. "Oh, you know my name."
Miss Haythorn. "I heard your friend mention it. Oh, I wish we were out of this dark place."
Dolignan. "I could be content to spend hours here, reassuring you, sweet lady."
Miss Haythorn. "Nonsense."
Dolignan. "Mwah." Grave reader, do not put your lips to the cheek of the next pretty creature you meet, or you will understand what this means.
Miss Haythorn. "Oh, oh!"
Friend. "Oh, what's the matter?"
Miss Haythorn.
"Open the door! Open the door!"
The door was opened. There was a sound of hurried whispers. The door was shut, and the blind pulled down with hostile sharpness. Miss Haythorn's scream lost a part of its effect, because the engine whistled 40,000 murders at the same moment, and fictitious grief makes itself heard when real cannot. Between the tunnel and Bath, our young friend had time to ask himself whether his conduct had been marked by that delicate reserve which is supposed to distinguish the perfect gentleman. With a long face, real or feigned, he held open the door. His late friends attempted to escape on the other side. Impossible. They must pass him. She whom he had insulted, Latin for kissed, deposited somewhere at his foot a look of gentle blushing reproach. The other, whom he had not insulted, darted red-hot daggers at him from her eyes, and so they parted. It was perhaps fortunate for Dolignan that he had the grace to be friends with Major Hoskins of his regiment, a veteran laughed at by the youngsters, for the Major was too apt to look coldly upon billiard balls and cigars. He had seen cannon balls and linstocks. He had also, to tell the truth, swallowed a good bit of the mess-room poker, but with it some sort of moral poker, which made it as impossible for Major Hoskins to descend to an ungentlemanlike word or action as to brush his own trousers below the knee. Captain Dolignan told this gentleman his story in gleeful accents, but Major Hoskins heard him coldly, and as coldly answered that he had known a man lose his life for the same thing. "That is nothing," continued the Major, "but unfortunately he deserved to lose it." At this the blood mounted to the younger man's temples, and his senior added, "I mean to say, he was 35. You, I presume, are 21?
25. Oh, that's much the same thing. Will you be advised by me?" "Oh, if you will advise me." "Speak to no one of this, and send White the £3, that he may think you've lost the bet." "Oh, that's hard when I won it." "Do it for all that, sir." Let the disbelievers in human perfectibility know that this dragoon capable of a blush did this virtuous action, albeit with violent reluctance, and it was his first damper. A week after these events he was at a ball. He was in that state of factious discontent which belongs to us amiable English. He was looking in vain for a lady equal in personal attraction to the idea he had formed of George Dolignan as a man, when suddenly there glided past him a most delightful vision, a lady whose beauty and symmetry took him by the eyes. Another look. It can't be. Yes, it is. Miss Haythorn. Not that he knew her name, but what an apotheosis! The duck had become a peahen, radiant, dazzling. She looked twice as beautiful and almost twice as large as before. He lost sight of her. He found her again. She was so lovely she made him ill, and he alone must not dance with her nor speak to her. If he had been content to begin her acquaintance in the usual way, it might have ended in kissing. But having begun with kissing, it must end in nothing. As she danced, sparks of beauty fell from her on all around but him. She did not see him. It was clear she would never see him. One gentleman was particularly assiduous. She smiled on his assiduity. He was ugly, but she smiled on him. Dolignan was surprised at his success, his ill taste, his ugliness, his impertinence. Dolignan at last found himself injured. Who was this man, and what right had he to go on so? He had never kissed her, I suppose, said Dolly. Dolignan could not prove it, but he felt that somehow the rights of property were invaded. He went home and dreamed of Miss Haythorn, and hated all the ugly successful. A note: when our successful rival is ugly, the blow is doubly severe and crushing. We fall by bludgeon, we who thought the keenest rapier might perchance thrust at us in vain. He spent a fortnight trying to find out who this beauty was. He never could encounter her again. At last he heard of her in this way. A lawyer's clerk paid him a little visit, and commenced a little action against him in the name of Miss Haythorn for insulting her in a railway train. The young gentleman was shocked, endeavoured to soften the lawyer's clerk. That machine did not thoroughly comprehend the meaning of the term. The lady's name, however, was at last revealed by this untoward incident. From her name to her address was but a short step, and the same day our crestfallen hero lay in wait at her door, and many a succeeding day, without effect. But one fine afternoon she issued forth quite naturally, as if she did it every day, and walked briskly on the nearest parade. Dolignan did the same. He met and passed her many times on the parade, and searched for pity in her eyes, but found neither look, nor recognition, nor any other sentiment. For all this she walked and walked, till all the other promenaders were tired and gone. Then her culprit summoned resolution, and taking off his hat with a voice tremulous for the first time, besought permission to address her. She stopped, blushed, and neither acknowledged nor disowned his acquaintance. He blushed, and stammered out how ashamed he was, how he deserved to be punished, how he was punished, how little she knew how unhappy he was, and concluded by begging her not to let all the world know the disgrace of a man who was already mortified enough by the loss of her acquaintance. She asked an explanation. He told her of the action that had been commenced in her name, and she gently shrugged her shoulders and said, "Oh, how stupid they are." Emboldened by this, he begged to know whether or not a life of distant, unpretending devotion would, after a lapse of years, erase the memory of his madness, his crime. She did not know. She must now bid him adieu, as she had some preparations to make for a ball in the Crescent, where everybody was to be. They parted, and Dolignan determined to be at the ball where everybody was to be. He was there, and after some time he obtained an introduction to Miss Haythorn, and he danced with her.
Her manner was gracious. With the wonderful tact of her sex, she seemed to have commenced the acquaintance that evening. That night, for the first time, Dolignan was in love. I will spare the reader all the lover's arts by which he succeeded in dining where she dined, in dancing where she danced, in overtaking her by accident when she rode. His devotion followed her even to church, where our dragoon was rewarded by learning there is a world where they neither polk nor smoke, the two capital abominations of this one. He made acquaintance with her uncle, who liked him, and he saw at last with joy that her eye loved to dwell upon him when she thought he did not observe her. It was 3 months after the Box Tunnel that Captain Dolignan called one day upon Captain Hawthorne, R.N., whom he had met twice in his life, and slightly propitiated by resolutely listening to a cutting-out expedition. He called, and in the usual way asked permission to pay his addresses to his daughter. The worthy captain straightway began doing quarter-deck, when suddenly he was summoned from the apartment by a mysterious message. On his return, he announced with a total change of voice that it was all right, and his visitor might run alongside as soon as he chose. My reader has divined the truth. This nautical commander, terrible to the foe, was in complete and happy subjugation to his daughter, our heroine. As he was taking leave, Dolignan saw his divinity glide into the drawing-room. He followed her, observed a sweet consciousness which encouraged him. That consciousness deepened into confusion. She tried to laugh. She cried instead, and then she smiled again. And when he kissed her hand at the door, it was George and Marion, instead of Captain this and Miss the other. A reasonable time after this, for my tale is merciful and skips formalities and torturing delays, these two were very happy. They were once more upon the railroad, going to enjoy the honeymoon all by themselves. Marion Dolignan was dressed just as before, duck-like and delicious, all bright except her clothes. But George sat beside her this time instead of opposite, and she drank him in gently from under her long eyelashes.
Marion, said George, married people should tell each other all. Will you ever forgive me if I own to you? Oh, no.
Yes, yes.
Well, then, you remember the Box Tunnel?
This was the first allusion he had ventured to it.
I'm ashamed to say I had bet £3 to £10 with White I would kiss one of you two ladies.
And George, pathetic externally, chuckled within. Oh, I know that, George. I overheard you, was the demure reply.
You overheard me? Impossible.
And did you not hear me whisper to my companion? I made a bet with her.
You made a bet? How singular. What was it?
Only a pair of gloves, George.
Oh, yes, I know. But what about?
Oh, that if you did, you should be my husband, dearest.
Oh, but stay. Then you could not have been so very angry with me, love. Why, dearest, then who brought that action against me?
Mrs. Dolignan looked down. I was afraid you were forgetting me. George, you will never forgive me?
Oh, sweet angel. Oh, why, here is the Box Tunnel.
Now, reader, fie. No such thing. You can't expect to be indulged in this way every time we come to a dark place. Besides, it's not the thing. Consider, two sensible, married people. No such phenomenon, I assure you, took place. No scream issued in hopeless rivalry of the engine. This time, End of the Box Tunnel, by Charles Reade.
The Extravagance of Love, by Archbishop Alexander. Whenever this gospel was preached, this that she had done shall be told as a memorial of her. What a gracious memorial, and how worthy of it was Mary's beautiful outburst of generosity. But what a pity that the speech of Judas should be recorded also as a memorial of him. And yet, on mature consideration, we would not have the Judas criticism forgotten, because it called forth what we might not otherwise have had, the vindication of Jesus himself, and because, as a matter of fact, we are constantly hearing the protest of Judas repeated in our own day, and are often ill-held to know how to meet it. This, he said, records our evangelist bluntly, not because he loved the poor, but because he was a thief and kept the bag. Yet he might have been an honest man and said the same thing, for very many honest and earnest men and women are repeating this criticism still. It is repeated whenever it is taken for granted that practical utility is the only standard by which to judge actions and offerings, that God and man can be served in no other way than by iron bars and perspiration. How often do we meet the type of mind that admits the service of a ploughman and denies that of poet or artist, for whom the waterfall, as somebody has said, exists merely as so much power for driving turbines, and whose sole test of usefulness is that of making two blades grow, and corn blades at that, where but one grew before. We are commonly browbeaten by this type of person, and yet we feel that somehow, if we could only say it, he is wrong, that the poet's is as divine a vocation as the farmer's, that God meant a silver band of falling water in a green glade to suggest other things besides dynamos, and that he who even paints some blades of grass, and paints them pleasingly, has his place somewhere in the great guild of servants of God and man. One has heard the same attitude taken up in other directions too. Why spend so much money on a church, you will be asked, when there are so many poor people in the land? What need for stone pillars and a fine organ, when a plain building and a harmonium would do as well? Why try to secure what is called a beautiful church service, dignified, stately, musical, when the very baldest worship is acceptable in God's sight, if only it be sincere? We have heard all that and other remarks like that often, and we have seldom been able to give reasons against them. A mere instinctive sentiment seems a feeble thing to oppose to such cold and hard facts. Yet somehow we feel that it is all wrong if only we knew how to convict it. Did it ever occur to you that Jesus himself has answered that objection and others like it when he vindicated Mary's action that night? There is no doubt that her ointment cost a deal of money that could have fed many hungry people. It was an extravagant offering without any practical outcome, save that Jesus was refreshed. There is no doubt also about our Lord's sympathy with the poor and needy, and yet he upheld Mary's action and would not have it called wasteful. All that could be said in this favour was that it was beautiful, that it touched Jesus keenly and influenced all who saw it done, and that, as I read the story, was one reason at least why Jesus defended it. He allows the beautiful. He would have the beautiful honoured, even in a world so full of sorrow and trouble as this. For my part, I am very grateful that this word of Christ's has been recorded, for it affords sufficient warrant for declaring the poet, the artist, the architect, and all those who are trying to make the world more beautiful, God's servants too, offering him a gift he does not disdain to recognize, as truly as the physician, the philanthropist, and the preacher, whose object is to make it better. Beauty of form and structure has been lavished profusely by the Creator on creatures too small to be seen. There are more things grow out of God's earth than corn for food or timber for building houses. There's the heather and the wild flowers, the daisies and the violets. Hard-headed common sense asks, what's the use of them? What good do they do? The answer is that they are beautiful, and that seems in God's sight to be justification enough for having made them. So when we see love breaking her alabaster box and pouring forth her offering without stint, as she is doing every day, a mother lavishing care upon an ungrateful son, a husband surrounding a peevish wife with a tireless devotion, or a sister keeping her own love dream at arm's length that she may guard and guide some graceless brother, let us lay our hands upon our lips when we are tempted to criticize. These actions may be foolish, extravagant, quixotic, and may outrage every canon of common sense, but there is a fragrance about them without which the world would be much poorer. They are morally beautiful, and for that reason our Lord himself would teach us they are not to be rudely handled, nor judged by any hard standard. Yes, but he said more than that. He found a more complete extenuation of Mary's extravagance. It was because she loved much. Her gift was an offering of love to himself. She hath done it for my burial. And that is the end of the whole matter, my brothers. Love is always extravagant when measured by the tape line of bare duty. It always overflows. It breaks its box and gives everything it has. Yet, like the widow's curse of old, its casket is never empty, for even when it has given its all, the next needy case will find succour at that door. Take your charity subscription sheet to the man who loudly asserts that too much money is being given to the kirk this dull season, and what will you get? Take it also to the man who has signed a bigger cheque than he can well afford, that the house of his God may be made beautiful, and it will be strange if you are sent empty away. Oh no, it is not Mary whose devotion has found outlet in some sudden generosity. It is not she who neglects the poor. End of The Extravagance of Love by Archibald Alexander.
The Doll's Ghost by Frances Marion Crawford. It was a terrible accident, and for one moment the splendid machinery of Cranston House got out of gear and stood still. The butler emerged from the retirement in which he spent his elegant leisure. Two grooms of the chambers appeared simultaneously from opposite directions. There were actually housemaids on the grand staircase, and those who remember the facts most exactly assert that Mrs. Pringle herself positively stood upon the landing. Mrs. Pringle was the housekeeper. As for the head nurse, the undernurse, and the nursery maid, their feelings cannot be described. The head nurse laid one hand upon the polished marble balustrade and stared stupidly before her. The undernurse stood rigid and pale, leaning against the polished marble wall, and the nursery maid collapsed and sat down upon the polished marble step just beyond the limits of the velvet carpet, and frankly burst into tears. The Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop, youngest daughter of the 9th Duke of Cranston, and aged 6 years and 3 months, picked herself up quite alone, and sat down on the 3rd step from the foot of the grand staircase in Cranston House. "Oh!" ejaculated the butler, and he disappeared again. "Ah!" responded the grooms of the chamber, and they also went away. "It's only that doll," Mrs. Pringle was distinctly heard to say in a tone of contempt. The undernurse heard her say it. Then the 3 nurses gathered round Lady Gwendolen and patted her and gave her unhealthy things out of their pockets and hurried her out of Cranston House as fast as they could, lest it should be found out upstairs that they had allowed the Lady Gwendolen Lancaster Douglas Scroop to tumble down the grand staircase with her doll in her arms. And as the doll was badly broken, the nursery maid carried it, with the pieces, wrapped up in Lady Gwendolen's little cloak. It was not far from Hyde Park, and when they had reached a quiet place, they took means to find out that Lady Gwendolen had no bruises, for the carpet was very thick and soft, and there was thick stuff under it to make it softer. Lady Gwendolen Douglas Scroop sometimes yelled, but she never cried. It was because she had yelled that the nurse had allowed her to go downstairs alone with Nina, the doll, under one arm, while she steadied herself with her other hand on the balustrade and trod upon the polished marble steps beyond the edge of the carpet. So she had fallen, and Nina had come to grief. When the nurses were quite sure that she was not hurt, they unwrapped the doll and looked at her in her turn. She had been a very beautiful doll, very large and fair and healthy, with real yellow hair and eyelids that would open and shut over very grown-up dark eyes. Moreover, when you moved her right arm up and down, she said, "Papa," and when you moved the left, she said, Mama, very distinctly. I heard her say Pa when she fell, said the under-nurse, who heard everything. But she ought to have said Papa. That's because her arm went up when she hit the step, said the head nurse. She'll say the other Pa when you put it down again. Pa, said Nina, as her right arm was pushed down, and speaking through her broken face. It was cracked right across from the upper corner of the forehead with a hideous gash, through the nose and down to the little frilled collar of the pale green silk Mother Hubbard frock, and 2 little 3-cornered pieces of porcelain had fallen out. I'm sure it's a wonder she can speak at all, being all smashed, said the under-nurse. You'll have to take her to Mr. Puckler, said her superior. It's not far, and you'd better go at once. Lady Gwendolen was occupied in digging a hole in the ground with a little spade, and paid no attention to the nurses. What are you doing? Inquired the nursery maid, looking on. Nina's dead, and I'm digging her a grave, replied her ladyship thoughtfully. Oh, she'll come to life again, all right, said the nursery maid. The under-nurse wrapped Nina up again and departed. Fortunately, a kind soldier with very long legs and a very small cap happened to be there, and as he had nothing to do, he offered to see the under-nurse safely to Mr. Puckler's and back. Mr. Bernard Puckler and his little daughter lived in a little house in a little alley which led out off a quiet little street not very far from Belgrave Square. He was the great doll doctor, and his extensive practice lay in the most aristocratic quarter. He mended dolls of all sizes and ages, boy dolls and girl dolls, baby dolls in long clothes, and grown-up dolls in fashionable gowns, talking dolls and dumb dolls, those that shut their eyes when they lay down, and those whose eyes had to be shut for them by means of a mysterious wire. His daughter, Elsa, was only just over 12 years old, but she was already very clever at mending dolls' clothes and at doing their hair, which is harder than you might think, though the dolls sit quite still while it is being done. Mr. Puckler had originally been a German, but he had dissolved his nationality in the ocean of London many years ago, like a great many foreigners. He still had 1 or 2 German friends, however, who came on Saturday evenings, and smoked with him and played piquet or scat with him for farthing points, and called him Herr Doctor, which seemed to please Mr. Puckler very much. He looked older than he was, for his beard was rather long and ragged, his hair was grizzled and thin, and he wore horn-rimmed spectacles. As for Elsa, she was a thin, pale child, very quiet and neat, with dark eyes and brown hair that was plaited down her back and tied with a bit of black ribbon. She mended the dolls' clothes and took the dolls back to their homes when they were quite strong again. The house was a little one, but too big for the 2 people who lived in it. There was a small sitting room on the street, and the workshop was at the back, and there were 3 rooms upstairs. But the father and daughter lived most of their time in the workshop because they were generally at work, even in the evenings. Mr. Puckler laid Nina on the table and looked at her a long time till the tears began to fill his eyes behind the horn-rimmed spectacles. He was a very susceptible man, and he often fell in love with the dolls he mended, and found it hard to part with them when they had smiled at him for a few days. They were real little people to him, with characters and thoughts and feelings of their own, and he was very tender with them all. But some attracted him especially from the first, and when they were brought to him maimed and injured, their state seemed so pitiful to him that the tears came easily. You must remember that he lived among dolls during a great part of his life, and understood them. How do you know they feel nothing? He went on to say to Elsa. You must be gentle with them. It costs nothing to be kind to the little beings, and perhaps it makes a difference to them. And Elsa understood him because she was a child, and she knew that she was more to him than all the dolls. He fell in love with Nina at first sight, perhaps because her beautiful brown glass eyes were something like Elsa's own, and he loved Elsa first and best, with all his heart. And besides, it was a very sorrowful case. Nina had evidently not been long in the world, for her complexion was perfect, Her hair was smooth where it should be smooth, and curly where it should be curly, and her silk clothes were perfectly new. But across her face was that frightful gash, like a saber cut, deep and shadowy within, but clean and sharp on the edges. When he tenderly pressed her head to close the gaping wound, the edges made a fine grating sound that was painful to hear, and the lids of the dark eyes quivered and trembled, as though Nina were suffering dreadfully. "Poor Nina," he exclaimed sorrowfully, "but I shall not hurt you much, though you will take a long time to get strong." He always asked the names of the broken dolls when they were brought to him, and sometimes the people knew what the children called them and told him. He liked Nina for a name, altogether, and in every way she pleased him more than any doll he had seen for many years, and he felt drawn to her, and made up his mind to make her perfectly strong and sound, no matter how much labor it might cost him. Mr. Puckler worked patiently, a little at a time, and Elsa watched him. She could do nothing for poor Nina, whose clothes needed no mending. The longer the doll doctor worked, the more fond he became of the yellow hair and the beautiful brown glass eyes. He sometimes forgot all the other dolls that were waiting to be mended, lying side by side on a shelf, and sat for an hour gazing at Nina's face, while he racked his ingenuity for some new invention by which to hide even the smallest trace of the terrible accident. She was wonderfully mended. Even he was obliged to admit that, but the scar was still visible to his keen eyes, a very fine line right across the face, downwards from right to left. Yet all the conditions had been most favorable for a cure, since the cement had set quite hard at the first attempt, and the weather had been fine and dry, which makes a great difference in a doll's hospital. At last he knew that he could do no more, and the under-nurse had already come twice to see whether the job was finished, as she coarsely expressed it. "Nina is not quite strong yet," Mr. Puckler had answered each time, for he could not make up his mind to face the parting. And now he sat before the square deal table at which he worked, and Nina laid before him for the last time, with a big brown paper box beside her. It stood there like her coffin, waiting for her, he thought. He must put her into it, and lay tissue paper over her dear face, and then put on the lid, and at the thought of tying the string, his sight was dim with tears again. He was never to look into the glassy depths of the beautiful brown eyes any more, nor to hear the little wooden voice saying, "Papa" and "Mama." It was a very painful moment. In the vain hope of gaining time before the separation, he took up the little sticky bottles of cement and glue and gum and color, looking at each one in turn, and then at Nina's face, and all his small tools lay there, neatly arranged in a row. But he knew that he could not use them again for Nina. She was quite strong at last, and in a country where there should be no cruel children to hurt her, she might live 100 years, with only that almost imperceptible line across her face to tell of the fearful thing that had befallen her on the marble steps of Cranston House. Suddenly Mr. Puckler's heart was quite full, and he rose abruptly from his seat and turned away. "Elsa," he said unsteadily, "you must do it for me. I cannot bear to see her go into the box." So he went and stood at the window with his back turned, while Elsa did what he had not the heart to do. "Is it done?" he asked, not turning around. "Then take her away, my dear. Put on your hat and take her to Cranston House quickly, and when you are gone I will turn around." Elsa was used to her father's queer ways with the dolls, and though she had never seen him so much moved by a parting, she was not much surprised. "Come back quickly," he said, when he heard her hand on the latch. "It is growing late, and I should not send you at this hour, but I cannot bear to look forward to it any more." When Elsa was gone, he left the window and sat down in his place before the table again to wait for the child to come back. He touched the place where Nina had lain, very gently, and he recalled the softly tinted pink face, and the glass eyes, and the ringlets of her yellow hair, till he could almost see them. The evenings were long, for it was late in the spring, but it began to grow dark soon, and Mr. Puckler wondered why Elsa did not come back. She had been gone an hour and a half, and that was much longer than he had expected, for it was barely half a mile from Belgrave Square to Cranston House. He reflected that the child might have been kept waiting, but as the twilight deepened, he grew anxious and walked up and down in the dim workshop, no longer thinking of Nina, but of Elsa, his own living child whom he loved. An undefinable, disquieting sensation came upon him by fine degrees, a chilliness and a faint stirring of his thin hair, joined with a wish to be in any company rather than to be alone much longer. It was the beginning of fear. He told himself in strong German English that he was a foolish old man, and he began to feel about for the matches in the dusk. He knew just where they should be, for he always kept them in the same place, close to the little tin box that held bits of sealing wax of various colors for some kinds of mending. But somehow he could not find the matches in the gloom. Something had happened to Elsa, he was sure, and as his fear increased, he felt as though it might be allayed if he could get a light and see what time it was. Then he called himself a foolish old man again, and the sound of his own voice startled him in the dark. He could not find the matches. The window was gray still. He might see what time it was if he went close to it, and he could go and get the matches out of the cupboard afterwards. He stood back from the table to get out of the way of the chair, and began to cross the board floor. Something was following him in the dark. There was a small pattering, as of tiny feet upon the boards. He stopped and listened, and the roots of his hair tingled. It was nothing. He was a foolish old man. He made 2 steps more, and he was sure that he heard the little pattering again. He turned his back to the window, leaning against the sash so that the panes began to crack, and he faced the dark. Everything was quite still, and it smelt of paste and cement and wood filings as usual. "Is that you, Elsa?" he asked, and he was surprised by the fear in his voice. There was no answer in the room, and he held up his watch and tried to make out what time it was by the gray dusk that was just not darkness. As far as he could see, it was within 2 or 3 minutes of 10 o'clock. He had been a long time alone. He was shocked and frightened for Elsa out in London so late, and he almost ran across the room to the door. As he fumbled for the latch, he distinctly heard the running of little feet after him. "Mice!" he exclaimed feebly, just as he got the door open. He shut it quickly behind him, and felt as though some cold thing had settled on his back and were writhing upon him. The passage was quite dark, but he found his hat and was out in the alley in a moment, breathing more freely, and surprised to find how much light there still was in the open air. He could see the pavement clearly under his feet, and far off in the street to which the alley led, he could hear the laughter and calls of children playing some game out of doors. He wondered how he could have been so nervous, and for an instant he thought of going back into the house to wait quietly for Elsa. But instantly he felt that nervous fright of something stealing over him again. In any case, it was better to walk up to Cranston House and ask the servants about the child. One of the women had perhaps taken a fancy to her, and was even now giving her tea and cake. He walked quickly to Belgrave Square, and then up the broad streets, listening as he went whenever there was no other sound for the tiny footsteps. But he heard nothing, and was laughing at himself when he rang the servants' bell at the big house. Of course, the child must be there. The person who opened the door was quite an inferior person, for it was a back door, but affected the manners of the front, and stared at Mr. Puckler superciliously under the strong light. No little girl had been seen, and he knew nothing about no dolls. "She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckler tremulously, for all his anxiety was returning tenfold, "and I am afraid something has happened." The inferior person said rudely that nothing could have happened to her in that house because she had not been there, which was a jolly good reason why. and Mr. Puckler was obliged to admit that the man ought to know, as it was his business to keep the door and let people in. He wished to be allowed to speak to the under-nurse, who knew him, but the man was ruder than ever, and finally shut the door in his face. When the doll doctor was alone in the street, he steadied himself by the railing, for he felt as though he were breaking in two, just as some dolls break in the middle of the backbone. Presently he knew that he must be doing something to find Elsa, and that gave him strength. He began to walk as quickly as he could through the streets, following every highway and byway which his little girl might have taken on her errand. He also asked several policemen in vain if they had seen her, and most of them answered him kindly, for they saw that he was a sober man and in his right senses, and some of them had little girls of their own. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when he went up to his own door again, worn out and hopeless and broken-hearted. As he turned the key in the lock, his heart stood still, for he knew that he was awake and not dreaming, and that he really heard those tiny footsteps pattering to meet him inside the house along the passage. But he was too unhappy to be much frightened any more, and his heart went on again with a dull, regular pain that found its way all through him with every pulse. So he went in and hung up his hat in the dark, and found the matches in the cupboard and the candlestick in its place in the corner. Mr. Puckler was so much overcome and so completely worn out that he sat down in his chair before the work table and almost fainted as his face dropped forward upon his folded hands. Beside him, the solitary candle burned steadily with a low flame in the still warm air. "Elsa, Elsa," he moaned against his yellow knuckles, and that was all he could say, and it was no relief to him. On the contrary, the very sound of the name was a new and sharp pain that pierced his ears and his head and his very soul. For every time he repeated the name, it meant that little Elsa was dead, somewhere out in the streets of London in the dark. He was so terribly hurt that he did not even feel something pulling gently at the skirt of his old coat, so gently that it was like the nibbling of a tiny mouse. He might have thought that it was really a mouse if he had noticed it. "Elsa, Elsa," he groaned right against his hands. Then a cool breath stirred his thin hair, and the low flame of the one candle dropped down almost to a mere spark, not flickering as though a draught were going to blow it out, but just dropping down as if it were tired out. Mr. Puckler felt his hands stiffening with fright under his face, and there was a faint rustling sound, like some small silk thing blown in a gentle breeze. He sat up straight, stark and scared, and a small wooden voice spoke in the stillness. "Ba," it said, with a break between the syllables. Mr. Puckler stood up in a single jump, and his chair fell over backwards with a smashing noise upon the wooden floor. The candle had almost gone out. It was Nina's doll voice that had spoken, and he should have known it among the voices of 100 other dolls. And yet there was something more in it, a little human ring, with a pitiful cry and a call for help and the wail of a hurt child. Mr. Puckler stood up, stark and stiff, and tried to look round, but at first he could not, for he seemed to be frozen from head to foot. Then he made a great effort, and he raised one hand to each of his temples and pressed his own head round as he would have turned a doll's. The candle was burning so low that it might as well have been out altogether for any light it gave, and the room seemed quite dark at first. Then he saw something. He would not have believed that he could be more frightened than he had been just before that, but he was, and his knees shook, for he saw the doll standing in the middle of the floor, shining with a faint and ghostly radiance, her beautiful glassy brown eyes fixed on his. And across her face the very thin line of the break he had mended shone as though it were drawn in light with a fine point of white flame. Yet there was something more in the eyes, too. There was something human, like Elsa's own, but as if only the doll saw him through them and not Elsa. And there was enough of Elsa to bring back all his pain and to make him forget his fear. "Elsa, my little Elsa," he cried aloud. The small ghost moved, and its doll arm slowly rose and fell with a stiff mechanical motion. "Papa," it said. It seemed this time that there was even more of Elsa's tone echoing somewhere between the wooden notes that reached his ears so distinctly and yet so far away. Elsa was calling him, he was sure. His face was perfectly white in the gloom, but his knees did not shake any more, and he felt that he was less frightened. "Yes, child, but where? Where?" he asked. "Where are you, Elsa?" "Papa." The syllables died away in the quiet room. There was a low rustling of silk, the glassy brown eyes turned slowly away, and Mr. Puckler heard the pitter-patter of the small feet in the bronze kid slippers as the figure ran straight to the door. Then the candle burned high again, the room was full of light, and he was alone. Mr. Puckler passed his hand over his eyes and looked about him. He could see everything quite clearly, and he felt that he must have been dreaming, though he was standing instead of sitting down, as he should have been if he had just waked up. The candle burned brightly now. There were the dolls to be mended, lying in a row with their toes up. The third one had lost her right shoe, and Elsa was making one. He knew that, and he was certainly not dreaming now. He had not been dreaming when he had come in from his fruitless search and had heard the doll's footsteps running to the door. He had not fallen asleep in the chair. How could he possibly have fallen asleep when his heart was breaking? He had been awake all the time. He steadied himself, set the fallen chair upon its legs, and said to himself again very emphatically that he was a foolish old man. He ought to be out in the streets looking for his child, asking questions and inquiring at the police stations, where all accidents were reported as soon as they were known, or at the hospitals. "Papa!" The longing, wailing, pitiful little wooden cry rang from the passage outside the door, and Mr. Puckler stood for an instant with white face, transfixed and rooted to the spot. A moment later his hand was on the latch. Then he was in the passage, with the light streaming from the open door behind him. Quite at the other end he saw the little phantom shining clearly in the shadow, and the right hand seemed to beckon to him as the arm rose and fell once more. He knew all at once that it had not come to frighten him, but to lead him, and when it disappeared and he walked boldly towards the door, he knew that it was in the street outside, waiting for him. He forgot that he was tired and had eaten no supper and had walked many miles, for a sudden hope ran through and through him like a golden stream of life. And sure enough, at the corner of the alley and at the corner of the street, and out in Belgrave Square, he saw the small ghost flitting before him. Sometimes it was only a shadow where there was other light, but then the glare of the lamps made a pale green sheen on its little Mother Hubbard frock of silk, and sometimes when the streets were dark and silent, the whole figure shone out brightly with its yellow curls and rosy neck. It seemed to trot along like a tiny child, and Mr. Puckler could almost hear the pattering of the bronze kid slippers on the pavement as it ran. But it went very fast, and he could only just keep up with it, tearing along with his hat on the back of his head, and his thin hair blown by the night breeze, and his horn-rimmed spectacles firmly set upon his broad nose. On and on he went, and he had no idea where he was. He did not even care, for he knew certainly that he was going the right way. Then at last, in a wide, quiet street, he was standing before a big, sober-looking door that had 2 lamps on each side of it and a polished brass bell handle, which he pulled. And just inside, when the door was opened, in the bright light there was a little shadow and the pale green sheen of the little silk dress, and once more the small cry came to his ears, less pitiful, more longing. "Papa!" The shadow turned suddenly bright, and out of the brightness the beautiful brown glass eyes were turned up happily to his, while the rosy mouth smiled so divinely that the phantom doll looked almost like a little angel just then. A little girl was brought in soon after 10 o'clock. said the quiet voice of the hospital doorkeeper. I think they thought she was only stunned. She was holding a big brown paper box against her, and they could not get it out of her arms. She had a long plait of brown hair that hung down as they carried her. "She is my little girl," said Mr. Puckler. But he hardly heard his own voice. He leaned over Elsa's face in the gentle light of the children's ward, and when he had stood there a minute, the beautiful brown eyes opened and looked up to his. "Papa," cried Elsa softly, "I knew you would come." Then Mr. Puckler did not know what he did or said for a moment, and what he felt was worth all the fear and terror and despair that had almost killed him that night. But by and by Elsa was telling her story, and the nurse let her speak, for there were only 2 other children in the room who were getting well and were sound asleep. "They were big boys with bad faces," said Elsa, "and they tried to get Nina away from me, but I held on and fought as well as I could till one of them hit me with something, and I don't remember any more, for I tumbled down, and I suppose the boys ran away, and somebody found me there. But I'm afraid Nina is all smashed." "Here is the box," said the nurse. "We could not take it out of her arms till she came to herself. Should you like to see if the doll is broken?" And she undid the string cleverly, but Nina was all smashed to pieces. Only the gentle light of the children's ward made a pale green sheen in the folds of the little Mother Hubbard frock. End of The Doll's Ghost by Frances Marion Crawford.
A Service of Love by O. Henry. When one loves one's art, no service seems too hard. Well, that is our premise. This story shall draw a conclusion from it and show at the same time that the premise is incorrect. That will be a new thing in logic and a feat in storytelling somewhat older than the Great Wall of China. Joe Larrabee came out of the post oak flats of the Middle West, pulsing with a genius for pictorial art. At 6, he drew a picture of the town pump with a prominent citizen passing it hastily. This effort was framed and hung in the drugstore window by the side of the ear of corn with an uneven number of rows. At 20, he left for New York with a flowing necktie and capital tied up somewhat closer. Delia Carruthers did things in 6 octaves so promisingly in a pine tree village in the South that her relatives chipped in enough in her chip hat for her to go north and finish. They could not see her, but that is our story. Joe and Delia met in an atelier where a number of art and music students had gathered to discuss chiaroscuro, Wagner, music, Rembrandt's works, pictures, Waldteufel, wallpaper, Chopin, and Oolong. Joe and Delia became enamored one of the other, or each of the other, as you please, and in a short time were married. For when one loves one's art, no service seems too hard. Mr. and Mrs. Larrabee began housekeeping in a flat. It was a lonesome flat, something like the A sharp way down on the left end of a keyboard. And they were happy, for they had their art and they had each other. And my advice to the rich young man would be, sell all thou hast and give it to the poor janitor for the privilege of living in a flat with your art and your Delia. Flat dwellers shall endorse my dictum that theirs is the only true happiness. If a home is happy, it cannot fit too close. Let the dresser collapse and become a billiard table. Let the mantel turn into a rowing machine, the escritoire to a separate bedchamber, the washstand to an upright piano. Let the 4 walls come together, if they will, so you and your Delia are between. But if home be the other kind, let it be wide and long. Enter you at the Golden Gate. Hang your hat on Hatteras, your cape on Cape Cod, and go out by the Labrador. Joe was painting in the class of the great Magister. You know his fame. His fees are high, his lessons are light, his highlights have brought him renown. Delia was studying under Rosenstock. You know his repute as a disturber of the piano keys. They were mighty happy as long as their money lasted. So is every... But I will not be cynical. Their aims were very clear and defined. Joe was to become capable very soon of turning out pictures that old gentlemen with thin side whiskers and thick pocketbooks would sandbag one another in his studio for the privilege of buying. Delia was to become familiar and then contemptuous with music, so that when she saw the orchestra seats in boxes unsold, she would have a sore throat and lobster in a private dining room and refuse to go on the stage. But the best, in my opinion, was the home life in the little flat. The ardent, voluble chats after the day's study, the cozy dinners and fresh light breakfasts, the interchange of ambitions interwoven each with the others, or else inconsiderable, the mutual help and inspiration, and, overlook my artlessness, stuffed olives and cheese sandwiches at 11 p.m. But after a while, art flagged. It sometimes does, even if some switchman doesn't flag it. Everything going out and nothing coming in, as the Vulgarians say. Money was lacking to pay Mr. Magister and Herr Rosenstock their prices. When one loves one's art, no service seems too hard. So Delia said she must give music lessons to keep the chafing dish bubbling. For 2 or 3 days she went out canvassing for pupils. One evening she came home elated. "Joe, dear," she said gleefully, "I've a pupil, and oh, the loveliest people! General A.B. Pinckney's daughter on 71st Street. Such a splendid house, Joe. You ought to see the front door. Byzantine, I think you would call it. And inside, oh, Joe, I never saw anything like it before. My pupil is his daughter Clementina. I dearly love her already. She's a delicate thing, dresses always in white, and the sweetest, simplest manners. Only 18 years old. I'm to give 3 lessons a week, and just think, Joe, $5 a lesson. I don't mind it a bit, for when I get 2 or 3 more pupils, I can resume my lessons with Herr Rosenstock. Now, smooth out that wrinkle between your brows, dear, and let's have a nice supper." "Oh, that's all right for you, Delie," said Joe, attacking a can of peas with a carving knife and a hatchet. "But how about me? Do you think I'm going to let you hustle for wages while I philander in the regions of high art? Not by the bones of Benvenuto Cellini. I guess I can sell papers or lay cobblestones and bring in $1 or 2. Delia came and hung around his neck. "Joe, dear, you are silly. You must keep on at your studies. It is not as if I had quit my music and gone to work at something else. While I teach, I learn. I am always with my music, and we can live as happily as millionaires on $15 a week. You mustn't think of leaving Mr. Magister." "All right," said Joe, reaching for the blue scalloped vegetable dish. "But I hate for you to be giving lessons. It isn't art. But you're a trump and a dear to do it. When one loves one's art, no service seems too hard," said Delia. "Magister praised the sky in that sketch I made in the park," said Joe, "and Tinkle gave me permission to hang 2 of them in his window. I may sell one if the right kind of moneyed idiot sees them." "Well, I'm sure you will," said Delia sweetly. "And now let's be thankful for General Pinckney and this veal roast." During all of the next week, the Larrabees had an early breakfast. Joe was enthusiastic about some morning effect sketches he was doing in Central Park, and Delia packed him off breakfasted, coddled, praised, and kissed at 7 o'clock. Art is an engaging mistress. It was most times 7 o'clock when he returned in the evening. At the end of the week, Delia, sweetly proud but languid, triumphantly tossed 3 $5 bills on the 8 by 10 inches center table of the 8 by 10 feet flat parlor. "Sometimes," she said a little wearily, "Clementina tries me. I'm afraid she doesn't practice enough, and I have to tell her the same thing so often. And then she always dresses entirely in white, and that does get monotonous. But General Pinckney is the dearest old man. I wish you could know him, Joe. He comes in sometimes when I am with Clementina at the piano. He's a widower, you know, and stands there pulling on his white goatee." "And how are the semiquavers and the demi-semiquavers progressing?" he always asks. "I wish you could see the wainscoting in that drawing-room, Joe, and those astrakhan rug portieres, and Clementina has such a funny little cough. I hope she is stronger than she looks. Oh, I am really getting attached to her, Joe. She is so gentle and high-bred. General Pinckney's brother was once minister to Bolivia." And then Joe, with the air of a Monte Cristo, drew forth a 10, a 5, a 2, and a 1, all legal tender notes, and laid them beside Delia's earnings. "Sold that watercolor of the obelisk to a man from Peoria," he announced overwhelmingly. "Oh, don't joke with me," said Delia. "Not from Peoria." "All the way. I wish you could see him, Delia. Fat man with a woolen muffler and a quill toothpick. He saw the sketch in Tinkle's window and thought it was a windmill at first. He was game, though, and bought it anyhow. He ordered another, an oil sketch of the Lackawanna freight depot, to take back with him. Music lessons. Oh, I guess art is still in it." "I'm so glad you've kept on," said Delia heartily. "You're bound to win, dear. $33. We've never had so much to spend before. We'll have oysters tonight." "And filet mignon with champignons," said Joe. "Where is the olive fork?" On the next Saturday evening, Joe reached home first. He spread his $18 on the parlor table and washed what seemed to be a great deal of dark paint from his hands. Half an hour later, Delia arrived, her right hand tied up in a shapeless bundle of wraps and bandages. "How is this?" asked Joe after the usual greetings. Delia laughed, but not very joyously. "Clementina," she explained, "insisted on a Welsh rabbit after her lesson. She is such a queer girl. Welsh rabbits at 5 in the afternoon?" The general was there. You should have seen him run for the chafing dish, Joe, just as if there wasn't a servant in the house. "I know Clementina isn't in good health. She is so nervous. In serving the rabbit, she spilled a great lot of it boiling hot over my hand and wrist. It hurt awfully, Joe, and the dear girl was so sorry. But General Pinckney, Joe, that old man nearly went distracted. He rushed downstairs and sent somebody, they said the furnace man or somebody in the basement, out to a drugstore for some oil and things to bind it up with. It doesn't hurt so much now." "What's this?" asked Joe, taking the hand tenderly and pulling at some white strands beneath the bandages. "It's something soft," said Delia, "that had oil on it." "Oh, Joe, did you sell another sketch?" She had seen the money on the table. "Did I?" said Joe. "Just ask the man from Peoria. He got his depot today, and he isn't sure, but he thinks he wants another parkscape and a view on the Hudson. What time this afternoon did you burn your hand, Delia?" 5 o'clock, I think," said Delia plaintively. The rabbit came off the fire about that time. You ought to have seen General Pinckney, Joe, when—" "Sit down here a moment, Delia," said Joe. He drew her to the couch, sat down beside her, and put his arm across her shoulders. "What have you been doing for the past 2 weeks, Dealey?" he asked. She braved it for a moment or two, with an eye full of love and stubbornness, and murmured a phrase or two vaguely of General Pinckney. But at length down went her head, and out came the truth and tears. "I couldn't get any pupils," she confessed, "and I couldn't bear to have you give up your lessons, and I got a place ironing shirts in that big 24th Street laundry, and I think I did very well to make up both General Pinckney and Clementina, don't you, Joe? And when a girl in the laundry set down a hot iron on my hand this afternoon, I was all the way home making up that story about the Welsh rabbit. You're not angry, are you, Joe? And if I hadn't got the work, you mightn't have sold your sketches to that man from Peoria." "He wasn't from Peoria," said Joe slowly. "Well, it doesn't matter where he was from. How clever you are, Joe, and kiss me, Joe. And what made you ever suspect that I wasn't giving music lessons to Clementina?" "I didn't," said Joe, "until tonight, and I wouldn't have then, only I sent up this cotton waste and oil from the engine room this afternoon for a girl upstairs who had her hand burned with a smoothing iron. I've been firing the engine in that laundry for the past 2 weeks." "And then you didn't—" "My purchaser from Peoria," said Joe, "and General Pinckney are both creations of the same art. But you wouldn't call it either painting or music." And then they both laughed, and Joe began, "When one loves one's art, no service seems—" But Delia stopped him with her hand on his lips. "No," she said, "just when one loves." End of A Service of Love by O. Henry.
The Secret of Labra by T.W. Woolston. In very ancient days there was a king in Ireland named Labra, who was called Labra the Sailor, for a certain voyage that he made. Now Labra was never seen save by one man once a year, without a hood that covered his head and ears. But once a year it was his habit to let his hair be cropped, and the person to do this was chosen by lot, for the king was accustomed to put to death instantly the man who had cropped him. And so it happened that on a certain year the lot fell on a young man who was the only son of a poor widow who dwelt near by the palace of the king. When she heard that her son had been chosen, she fell on her knees before the king and besought him with tears that her son, who was her only support and all she had in the world, might not suffer death as was customary. The king was moved by her grief and her entreaties, and at last he consented that the young man should not be slain, provided that he vowed to keep secret to the day of his death what he should see. The youth agreed to this, and he vowed by the sun and the wind that he would never, so long as he lived, reveal to man what he should learn when he cropped the king's hair. So he did what was appointed for him and went home. But when he did so, he had no peace, for the wonder of the secret that he had learned preyed upon his mind, so that he could not rest for thinking of it and longing to reveal it, and at last he fell into a wasting sickness from it, and was near to die. Then there was brought to see him a wise druid, who was skilled in all maladies of the mind and body. And after he had talked with the youth, he said to his mother, "Thy son is dying of the burden of a secret, which he may not reveal to any man, but until he reveals it, he will have no ease. Let him therefore walk along the highway till he comes to a place where 4 roads meet. Let him then turn to the right, and the first tree that he shall meet on the roadside, let him tell the secret to it, and so it may be he shall be relieved, and his vow will not be broken." The mother told her son of the druid's advice, and next day he went upon his way till he came to 4 crossroads, and he took the road upon the right, and the first tree he found was a great willow tree. So the young man laid his cheek against the bark, and he whispered the secret to the tree. And as he turned back homeward, he felt lightened of his burden, and he leaped and sang, and ere many days were past, he was as well and light-hearted as ever he had been in his life. Some while after that, it happened that the king's harper, named Craftney, broke the straining post of his harp, and went out to seek for a piece of wood wherewith to mend it. And the first timber he found that would fit the purpose was the willow tree by the crossroads. He cut it down therefore, and took as much as would give him a new straining post, and he bore it home with him, and mended his harp with it. That night he played after meat before the king and his lords, as he was wont. But whatever he played and sang, the folk that listened to him seemed to hear only one thing: 2 horses' ears hath Labra the sailor. Then the king plucked off his hood, and after that he made no secret of his ears, and none suffered on account of them thenceforward. End of The Secret of Labra by T.W. Rolston.
The Wedding Gift by Grace Sartwell Mason. One of Barbara's reasons for accepting me was the fact that I was not prosperous. If you were, she said, we should have to live on the west side, with a velvet carpet in the parlor, 2 maids, and a mission dining room. The parlor and the mission dining room would bore me to tears, and I'd about as soon keep a rubber plant as 2 maids. I assured her there was no immediate prospect of my having any of these commonly prized adjuncts. Art, as she knew, was long. Its votaries must find their happiness not in gross material wealth, but in the finer coinage of ideas, of the creative fancy. Exactly, interrupted Barbara warmly. We are not like other people. The conventional things of life, such as houses and furniture and regular meals, you know, would hamper us. We must live for our art. Nothing else matters. And on this basis, we set up our goods in Greenwich Village at the top of a rambling old house. The good north light attracted me, and the irregularity of the rooms pleased Barbara. We covered the walls with burlap in a sad artistic tint, made a kitchen out of a screen and 2 biscuit boxes, thinly disguised our steamer trunks under a bit of Flemish tapestry, and hung our hokusai to the best advantage. Our housekeeping was of the lightest. It was positively airy on those days when Barbara wooed her muse, but as she said, who would be the slave to a breakfast or luncheon hour? As long as one was at peace with one's artistic conscience, what mattered meals? At night we rubbed from our brows the wrinkles of work and dined out with other demi-celebrities and demi-semi-celebrities in a soothing atmosphere of pink-shaded candles and artistic shop-talk. Our impromptu suppers, when Benson the artist or the clever Fenways or Jimmy Dick dropped in, were hilariously successful. Of course, the next morning was apt to be rather disagreeably untidy, with sticky dishes all about the place and empty olive bottles in the bathtub. And there was usually the janitor to pacify, on account of Jimmy Dick's noise. But Barbara liked it. She said it appealed to her imagination, like living one of Murger's stories, you know. I think she knew how pretty she was in my painting smock. She made a joke of the inconvenience of keeping one's best clothes in boxes under the bed, and declared, even as she grovelled in search of her hat with the pink plumes, that the life exactly suited her. We worked hard and happily. If we were sometimes a little crowded, we were at least not dull. And then there came Uncle Peter's wedding present. I had never quite believed in Barbara's Uncle Peter. He lived in a vague limbo known as the Northwest, and there was a tradition in Barbara's family that he was vastly wealthy, but inasmuch as none of them had seen or heard from him in years, it seemed to me highly probable that he was one of those pleasant myths no household should be without. Barbara was specially fond of the Uncle Peter tradition. She had sent him an announcement of our marriage, addressed in simple faith to Nome, and when a lean week was upon the Greenwich flat, she cheered herself by considering what she would do if Uncle Peter should send us a gold nugget or some mining stock for a wedding gift. I had lifted the voice of scorn so often against this relative of Barbara's that when she telephoned me one day that there was a letter from Uncle Peter, I told her I had no time for fairy tales. "But it's true," she cried over the telephone. "He's written, and he's sending a wedding gift, and he says, 'Take good care of the present I'm sending, and it will reward you.' Now, doesn't that mean nuggets or mining stock?" "Sounds like a Bible to me," I said, and Barbara rang off sharply. But in spite of myself, I was curious about this revival of Uncle Peter, so I put away my drawing board. I was at work in the zoo making sketches for Headley's wild animals in their native haunts, and went home early. I found Barbara sitting on the floor, and about her there billowed a sea of steamship literature. I should state here that Barbara cherished a dream of a year in Europe, and whenever she sold a tale or I drew a successful beast, our flat was flooded with booklets setting forth the allurements of every place on earth but home. When I saw her thus surrounded, I concluded that she must have landed a serial, but on inquiry I found it was Uncle Peter's letter that had so uplifted her. "I feel it in my bones," she cried, "that he's sending nuggets or a cunning bag of gold dust." Such is the infection of Barbara's optimism that I scoffed but weakly, and that night we celebrated on our expectations. After a dinner that we could not afford, we came home and spread out all the steamship epics on the table. We decided on Florence and Fiesole for the winter, with a few weeks in Paris. We got out Italian backgrounds and somebody on medieval towns, and we had altogether a joyous evening. Part 2. Next morning the present came. It took 2 strong men to drag it in. It was in a box about the size of our bathroom, with slats across the front. Through these there peered the bloodshot eyes of a huge animal. "You've made a mistake," I said sternly to the men, but Barbara, who had been reading the card on the box, cried out that it was the wedding present from Uncle Peter, and fell into a chair. I cannot classify the sort of seizure Barbara had when the men were gone. It seemed like hysterics mixed with the fit of temper. "Barbara, calm yourself," I besought her. "I can't. It's so funny, and I'm so mad." "Well, then, I'm going to let the beast out," I said. The threat had instant effect. Bab stopped gurgling and jumped up. "He may eat us alive," she cried. But I had been peering through the slats at the wedding gift, and I felt much braver. "I'll not let him harm you, Barbara," I said, and began to pry the slats from the box. Barbara armed herself with a Tanagra figurine and climbed into the Morris chair. When the last slat was off, I stepped aside hastily, for the beast, with a roar, precipitated itself into the room. I may as well get over this painful portion of my narrative as rapidly as possible. It is sufficient to state that to us, in a New York flat, our dear Uncle Peter had sent a Siberian bloodhound. The beast gamboled about with the airy grace of a rhinoceros, knocking over chairs and Barbara's tea table with the wagging of his tail. "I shall offer him for sale," I said disgustedly. "But what shall we do with him in the meantime? He's too big to be imprisoned in the bathroom, and the police won't allow him on the fire escape." Oh, look at him now," cried Barbara. Over his pendulous chops and his fierce red eyes a smile seemed to pass. He began a mincing shuffle toward Barbara, the droop of his tail seeming to say, "Don't be afraid, little girl," and laid his great head softly on her foot. "Why, he's taken to me," cried my wife, and I knew from her tone we were going to keep the beast. There is no use urging expediency where Barbara's affections are concerned. She had fallen in love with her wedding present. The dog had the tact to adore her, and keep him we must. We sadly put away the steamship literature and the guides to Italy and did some extra pot boilers to keep little Sunshine in food. What it cost me to silence the janitor I am ashamed to record, and as for the nice old lady in the next flat, she has never been the same since. It was a darkish day when she met Sunshine in the hall. I heard her shrieks and rushed out. In the corner she was dancing a wild fling of terror, while Sunshine, looking as pleasant as a hungry hippopotamus, frolicked about her, trying to be friends. This will illustrate his general reception. The poor dog had a perpetual craving for friends, but his appearance was against him. When Bab walked down the street with him, people whose hands he tried to lick fell away from him with shrieks, and mothers snatched their babies out of his path. As Barbara kept explaining, he had the gentlest nature, but no one believed her, and we were in a fair way to be sacrificed on the altar of our loyalty to Uncle Peter's gift. Coming home from the zoo one day, I was met in the hall by Barbara. "Thank heaven," she said as she seized me, "that we kept Sunshine." "Why?" I asked. "Has he bitten a book agent?" "No, but Uncle Peter has come all the way from the West to see if we are good to the dog." "I hope he realizes now," I said somewhat bitterly, "the inappropriateness of his gift." "I can't make him out," said Barbara. "But I could. He was evidently a man with a subterranean sense of humor. He saw the joke of what he had done. Also, I suspected he saw a joke in us and our menage. He was an apple-cheeked old fellow with keen blue eyes and a dry smile always hovering about the corners of his mouth. He was as much interested in us and our manner of living as if we were Aztec cliff dwellers. We gathered that he had supposed Greenwich to be a rural community, and that he had sent us the dog to protect Barbara from tramps while I was in the city. "I suppose," he said with a quaint twist to his smile after we had shown him all our clever space-saving schemes, "there's lots of people living like this, with their best hats under the bed and the cheese on the window-sill?" "Plenty of them, and geniuses, too," we assured him. "But," he persisted mildly, "if they'd move out into the country, they'd have room to stretch in and a dooryard and posy beds and shade trees and—" "We don't care for the conventional way of living," interrupted Barbara. "Art absorbs us. The true artist would not be hampered by houses or furniture. Of course, it would be nice to have a little more room on Sunshine's account. But as for ourselves, we are quite happy, and the flat is quite big enough." "Maybe, Uncle Peter chuckled as he rose to go. "But," and he turned to look slyly at her, "you'd be hard put to it to find room for a youngster or two, now wouldn't you?" "Vulgar old man," said Barbara when he had gone, and then she dimpled. "But he's lovely, too, so naive and primitive." I was not so rash in my classification of Uncle Peter, for it occurred to me as he dined or lunched with us during his stay in town that he listened to our theories with a humor which was not entirely unsophisticated. We were sincerely sorry when the old gentleman came finally to announce his departure for Nome. He had had a mighty good time, he said, and had learned a number of things. With this he chuckled and laid upon the table an oblong slip of paper. "That's my wedding present," he explained. "It's a kind of bet with myself, too. You see, I've always said that if you go deep enough, we're all pretty much alike, and right down at the bottom we're all after the same thing. But maybe geniuses are different. I dunno." And he grinned slyly. "Anyway, you can hit the trail for Italy now, if you want to. Goodbye, and let me know how you get along." After he had gone, it was several minutes before Barbara or I had courage to look at the oblong piece of paper. Then Barbara made a little rush and held it up. "Italy!" she cried. "I should say so! And Japan and Norway, if we like." Uncle Peter had certainly done handsomely by us. For the rest of the day we were in a state of dizzy excitement. We knocked off work and went for a walk with Sunshine between us. We blessed the day that Uncle Peter had sent us a dog and Barbara had fallen in love with him. But we were in far too exalted a state to puzzle over what our generous relative had meant by his parting speech to us. The next morning, after I had deposited the check, I should have gone to the zoo to work, but instead I strolled around town, thinking in coherent and affluent thoughts. I meant to go to the steamship offices, but I met an acquaintance who was in real estate, and he persuaded me to go out and look at an old country place he was offering for sale. He said the trip would do me good, and I might find some bits worth sketching. I knew I was wasting my time, but the country appealed to me. One gets a little stuffy tucked up in a Greenwich flat, and I went. As I turned in at the gate and moved up the gravel walk between rows of fine old maples, I was aware of something like a pang of desire. How roomy and cool and peaceful the old place looked. I went around to the back and sat down on the doorstep. After a long time, I remembered poor Barbara. I gave a farewell look at the lovely tangled old garden. I should be late for luncheon, but I'd appease Barbara by bringing her a fresh crop of steamship literature. I turned the corner of the house briskly, and there, on the front doorstep, sat Barbara and Sunshine. Sunshine drooped his great head close to Barbara's, for Barbara was crying. Deep down in my heart, something unaccountably hurt me. I stole up softly and put my arm around her. She looked scared at first, and then ashamed, and then all her most defiant brightness came back to her. She began to tell how she had taken Sunshine out for a fresh air excursion, and they had just dropped in there for a rest. At this point, I shook her gently. "Be honest, Barbara," I said sternly. "What are you doing here? Are you interested in real estate?" "Well," she said, "I heard the old Standish place was for sale, and I got to thinking what a nice home it would make for Sunshine. He's seemed rather droopy lately, and—" "What about Fiesole?" I hinted. The words seemed to rouse in her a sudden tempest. She jumped to her feet and stretched out her arms to the quiet old trees and the lovely tangled garden. "I want a house," she cried. "I want a really, truly home. I'm tired of keeping my clothes behind the piano and eating chafing dish food. I'm tired of a janitor and people above and below me. I'm tired of the Fenways and all poseurs. I know I'm common and bourgeois, but I want a place where there's room for something besides art, flowers and a kitchen range, and dogs and plenty of clothes presses and children. Ah, dear little Barbara, the old trees looking down on us must have thought we were lovers long estranged and reconciled at last. The leaves seemed to rub their hands softly as if something pleased them. I know my nose is red," said Barbara after a while. "And where is Sunshine?" Sunshine was discovered cooling his nose in the garden mold, having been stung by a bee. We were making a soothing poultice of mud for him when Bab looked up at me soberly. "I don't believe we're so different from other people after all," she said, and then suddenly sat down in the onion bed. "Why," she cried, "that's what Uncle Peter bet the $10,000 on." "And he's won," I shouted. We sat side by side in the onion bed and felt the burden of being different from other people roll from our shoulders. We were just commonplacely happy till finally the whiz of a distant trolley roused us. "If you're bent on buying this place, Barbara," I said, "we'd better hurry back to town before someone gets in ahead of us." And clapping the mud poultice on Sunshine's nose, we joined hands and ran for the car. End of The Wedding Gift by Grace Sartwell Mason.
Love on the Bon Dieu by Kate Chopin. Upon the pleasant veranda of Père Antoine's cottage that adjoined the church, a young girl had been seated awaiting his return. It was the eve of Easter Sunday, and since early afternoon the priest had been engaged in hearing the confessions of those who wished to make their Easters the following day. The girl did not seem impatient at his delay. On the contrary, it was very restful for her to lie back in the big chair she had found there and peep through the thick curtains of vines at the people occasionally passing along the village street. She was slender, with a frailness that indicated lack of wholesome and plentiful nourishment. A pathetic, uneasy look was in her gray eyes, and even faintly stamped her features, which were fine and delicate. In lieu of a big hat, a barrage veil covered her light brown and abundant hair. She wore a coarse white josie and a blue calico skirt that only half concealed her tattered shoes. As she sat there, she held carefully in her lap a parcel of eggs securely fastened in a red bandana handkerchief. Twice already a handsome, stalwart young man in quest of the priest had entered the yard and penetrated to where she sat. At first they had exchanged the uncompromising howdy of strangers and nothing more. The second time, finding the priest still absent, he hesitated to go at once. Instead, he stood upon the step and, narrowing his brown eyes, gazed beyond the river off toward the west, where a murky streak of mist was spreading across the sun. "It look like mo' rain," he remarked slowly and carelessly. "We done had about enough," she replied in much the same tone. "It's no chance to thin out the cotton," he went on. "And the bon Dieu," she resumed, "it's only today you can cross him on foot." "You live yonder on the bon Dieu, donc?" he asked, looking at her for the first time since he had spoken. "Yes, by Ned Hebert, monsieur." Instinctive courtesy held him from questioning her further, but he seated himself on the step, evidently determined to wait there for the priest. He said no more, but sat scanning critically the steps, the porch, and pillar beside him, from which he occasionally tore away little pieces of detached wood where it was beginning to rot at its base. A click on the side gate that communicated with the churchyard soon announced Père Antoine's return. He came hurriedly across the garden patch between the tall, lusty rose bushes that lined either side of it, which were now fragrant with blossoms. His long, flapping cassock added something of height to his undersized, middle-aged figure, as did the skull-cap, which rested securely back on his head. He saw only the young man at first, who rose at his approach. "Well, Azanor," he called cheerily in French, extending his hand, "how is this? I expected you all week." "Yes, monsieur, but I knew well what you wanted with me, and I was finishing the doors for Gros Lyon's new house," saying which he drew back and indicated by a motion and look that someone was present who had prior claim upon Père Antoine's attention. "Ah, Lélie!" the priest exclaimed, when he had mounted to the porch and saw her there behind the vines. "Have you been waiting here since you confessed? Surely an hour ago." "Yes, monsieur." "You should rather have made some visits in the village, child." "I am not acquainted with anyone in the village," she returned. The priest, as he spoke, had drawn a chair and seated himself beside her, with his hands comfortably clasping his knees. He wanted to know how things were out on the bayou. "And how is the grandmother?" he asked. "As cross and crabbed as ever? And with that," he added reflectively, "good for 10 years yet. I said only yesterday to Boutron, you know Boutron, he works at Les Blos Bon Dieu place, that Madame Zidore, how is it with her, Boutron? I believe God has forgotten her here on earth." "It isn't that, your reverence," said Boutron, "but it's neither God nor the devil that wants her." And Père Antoine laughed with a jovial frankness that shook all sting of ill nature from his very pointed remarks. Lélie did not reply when he spoke of her grandmother. She only pressed her lips firmly together and picked nervously at the red bandana. "I have come to ask, Monsieur Antoine," she began, lower than she needed to speak, for Azanor had withdrawn at once to the far end of the porch, "to ask if you will give me a little scrap of paper, a piece of writing for Monsieur Chartrand at the store over there. I want new shoes and stockings for Easter, and I have brought eggs to trade for them. He says he is willing, yes, if he was sure I would bring more every week till the shoes were paid for." With good-natured indifference, Père Antoine wrote the order that the girl had desired. He was too familiar with distress to feel keenly for a girl who was able to buy Easter shoes and pay for them with eggs. She immediately went away then, after shaking hands with the priest and sending a quick glance of her pathetic eyes toward Azanor, who had turned when he heard her rise, and nodded when he caught the look. Through the vines he watched her cross the village street. "How is it that you do not know Lely, Azenor? Surely you must have seen her pass your house often. It lies on her way to the Bon Dieu." "No, I don't know her. I have never seen her," the young man replied as he seated himself after the priest and kept his eyes absently fixed on the store across the road where he had seen her enter. "She is the granddaughter of that Madame Isidore." "What? Mama Isidore, whom they drove off that island last winter?" Yes. Well, you know, they say the old woman stole wood and things. I don't know how true it is, and destroyed people's property out of pure malice. And now she lives on the Bon Dieu? Yes, on Les Blois place, in a perfect wreck of a cabin. You see, she gets it for nothing. Not a Negro on the place but has refused to live in it. Surely it can't be that old abandoned hovel near the swamp that Michon occupied ages ago? That is the one, the very one. And the girl lives there with that old wretch? The young man marveled. Old wretch, to be sure, Azenor. But what can you expect from a woman who never crosses the threshold of God's house, who even tried to hinder the child doing so as well? But I went to her. I said, "See here, Madame Zedora, you know it's my way to handle such people without gloves. You may damn your soul if you choose." I told her, "That is a privilege which we all have, but none of us has a right to imperil the salvation of another. I want to see Lely at Mass hereafter on Sundays, or you will hear from me." And I shook my stick under her nose. Since then, the child has never missed a Sunday. But she is half starved. You can see that. You saw how shabby she is, how broken her shoes are. She is at Chartrand's now, trading for new ones with those eggs she brought. Poor thing. There's no doubt of her being ill-treated. Bertrand says he thinks Madame Zedore even beats the child. I don't know how true it is, for no power can make her utter a word against her grandmother. Azenor, whose face was a kind and sensitive one, had paled with distress as the priest spoke, and now, at these final words, he quivered as though he felt the sting of a cruel blow upon his own flesh. But no more was said of Lely, for Père Antoine drew the young man's attention to the carpenter work which he wished to entrust to him. When they had talked the matter over in all its lengthy details, Azenor mounted his horse and rode away. A moment's gallop carried him outside the village, then came a half-mile strip along the river to cover, and then the lane to enter, in which stood his dwelling midway upon a low, pleasant knoll. As Azenor turned into the lane, he saw the figure of Lely far ahead of him. Somehow he had expected to find her there, and he watched her again as he had done through Père Antoine's vines. When she passed his house, he wondered if she would turn to look at it. But she did not. How could she know it was his? Upon reaching it himself, he did not enter the yard, but stood there motionless, his eyes always fastened upon the girl's figure. He could not see, away off there, how coarse her garments were. She seemed, through the distance that divided them, as slim and delicate as a flower stalk. He stayed till he reached the turn of the lane and disappeared into the woods. Mass had not yet begun when Azenor tiptoed into church on Easter morning. He did not take his place with the congregation, but stood close to the holy water font and watched the people who entered. Almost every girl who passed him wore a white mull, a dotted Swiss, or a fresh starched muslin at least. They were bright with ribbons that hung from their persons and flowers that bedecked their hats. Some carried fans and cambric handkerchiefs. Most of them wore gloves and were odorant of poudre de riz, and nice toilet waters, while all carried gay little baskets filled with Easter eggs. But there was one who came empty-handed, save for the worn prayer book which she bore. It was Lélie, the veil upon her head, and wearing the blue print and cotton bodice which she had worn the day before. He dipped his hand to the holy water when she came, and held it out to her, though he had not thought of doing this for the others. She touched his fingers with the tips of her own, making a slight inclination as she did so, and after a deep genuflection before the blessed sacrament, passed on to the side. He was not sure if she had known him. He knew she had not looked into his eyes, for he would have felt it. He was angered against the other young women who passed him because of their flowers and ribbons when she wore none. He himself did not care, but he feared she might, and watched her narrowly to see if she did. But it was plain that Lélie did not care. Her face, as she seated herself, settled into the same restful lines it had worn yesterday, when she sat in Père Antoine's big chair. It seemed good to her to be there. Sometimes she looked up at the little colored panes through which the Easter sun was streaming, then at the flaming candles like stars, or at the embowered figures of Joseph and Mary flanking the central tabernacle which shrouded the risen Christ. Yet she liked just as well to watch the young girls in their spring freshness, or to sensuously inhale the mingled odor of flowers and incense that filled the temple. Lélie was among the last to quit the church. When she walked down the clean pathway that led from it to the road, she looked with pleased curiosity towards the groups of men and maidens who were gaily matching their Easter eggs under the shade of the china berry trees. Azenor was among them, and when he saw her coming solitary down the path, he approached her and with a smile extended his hat, whose crown was quite lined with the pretty colored eggs. "You must have forgot to bring eggs," he said. "Take some of mine." "No, merci," she replied, flushing and drawing back. But he urged them anew upon her. Much pleased, then, she bent her pretty head over the hat, and was evidently puzzled to make a selection among so many that were beautiful. He picked one out for her, a pink one, dotted with white clover leaves. "Yere," he said, handing it to her. "I think this is the purty, and it looks strong, too. I'm sure it will break all of the rest." And he playfully held out another, half hidden in his fist, for her to try its strength upon. But she refused to. She would not risk the ruin of her pretty egg. Then she walked away without once having noticed that the girls whom Azenor had left were looking curiously at her. When he rejoined them, he was hardly prepared for the greeting. It startled him. "How come you to talk to that girl? She's real canaille, her," was what one of them said to him. "Who say so? Who say she's canaille? If it's a man, I'll smash his head," he exclaimed, livid. They all laughed merrily at this. "And if it's a lady, Azenor, what you going to do about it?" asked another quizzingly. "'Tain't no lady. No lady would say that about a poor girl what she don't even know." He turned away, and emptying all his eggs into the hat of a little urchin who stood near, walked out of the churchyard. He did not stop to exchange another word with anyone, neither with the men who stood all en démarche before the stores, nor the women who were mounting upon horses and into vehicles or walking in groups to their homes. He took a short cut across the cotton field that extended back of the town, and walking rapidly soon reached his home. It was a pleasant house of a few rooms and many windows, with fresh air blowing through from every side. His workshop was beside it. A broad strip of greensward, studded here and there with trees, sloped down to the road. Agenor entered the kitchen, where an amiable old black woman was chopping onion and sage at a table. "Tranquilline," he said abruptly, There's a young girl going to pass here after a while. She's got a blue dress with a white josie on it and a veil on her head. When you see her, I want you to go to the road and make her rest there on the bench and ask her if she don't want a cup of coffee. I saw her go to the communion meet, and so she didn't eat any breakfast. Everybody else from the town that went to communion got invited somewhere or another. It's enough to make a person sick to see such meanness. And you want me to go tear down to the gate list so and ask her pine blank if she wants some coffee? Asked the bewildered Trinqueline. I don't care if you ask her point blank or not, but you do like I say. Trinqueline was leaning over the gate when Lily came by. Howdy, offered the woman. Howdy, the girl returned. Did you see a yellow calf with black spots on tarm coming down the lane, missy? No, not yellow, and not with black spot. May I seen one little white calf tied by the rope yonder around the bend. That warn't it. This here one was yellow. I hope he done flung himself down the bank and broke his neck. Sarve him right. But where you come from, child? You look plumb woe out. Sit down there on that bench and let me fetch you a cup of coffee. Agenor had already in his eagerness arranged a tray upon which was a smoking cup of café au lait. He had buttered and jellied generous slices of bread and was searching wildly for something when Trinqueline re-entered. What become of that half a chicken pie, Trinqueline, that was here in the garde manger today? What chicken pie? What garde manger? Blustered the woman. Like we got more'n one garde manger in the house, Trinqueline? You just like old Mama Azenora used to be, you is. You spec chicken pot pie gwine last eternal. When something done spilled, I flings it away. That's me. That's Trinqueline. So Agenor resigned himself, what could he do, and sent the tray incomplete as he fancied it out to Lely. He trembled at the thought of what he did, he whose nerves were usually as steady as some piece of steel mechanism. Would it anger her if she suspected? Would it please her if she knew? Would she say this or that to Trinqueline, and would Trinqueline tell him truly what she said and how she looked? As it was Sunday, Agenor did not work that afternoon. Instead, he took a book out under the trees, as he often did, and sat reading it from the first sound of the vesper bell that came faintly across the fields till the Angelus. All that time he turned many a page, yet in the end did not know what he had read. With his pencil he had traced Lely upon every margin, and was saying it softly to himself. Another Sunday Agenor saw Lely at Mass, and again. Once he walked with her and showed her the short-cut across the cotton field. She was very glad that day and told him she was going to work. Her grandmother said she might. So she was going to hoe up in the fields with Monsieur Leblanc's hands. He entreated her not to, and when she asked his reason, he could not tell her, but turned and tore shyly and savagely at the elder blossoms that grew along the fence. Then they stopped where she was going to cross the fence from the field to the lane. He wanted to tell her that was his house, which they could see not far away. But he did not dare to, since he had fed her on the morning she was hungry. And you say your grandma's going to let you work? She keeps you from working, don't? He wanted to question her about her grandmother, and could think of no other way to begin. Poor old grandmère, she answered. I don't believe she knows most of the time what she's doing. Sometimes she say I ain't no better than one nigger, and she force me to work. Then she say she know I'm going to be one canaille like mamam, and she make me sit down still, like she would want to kill me if I would move. Her, she only want to be out in the wood, day and night, day and night. She ain't got her right head, poor grandmère. I know she ain't. Lely had spoken in low and in jerks, as if every word gave her a pain. Agenor could feel her distress as plainly as he saw it. He wanted to say something to her, to do something for her, but her presence paralyzed him into inactivity, except his pulses that beat like hammers when he was with her. Such a poor, shabby little thing as she was, too. "I'm going to White Year next Sunday for you, Lele," he said, when the fence was between them, and he thought he had said something very daring. But the next Sunday she did not come. She was neither at the appointed place of meeting in the lane, nor was she at Mass. Her absence, so unexpected, affected Agenor like a calamity. Late in the afternoon, when he could stand the trouble and bewilderment of it no longer, he went and leaned over Père Antoine's fence. The priest was picking the slugs from his roses on the other side. "That young girl from the Bon Dieu," said Agenor. "She was not at Mass today. I suppose her grandmother has forgotten your warning." "No," answered the priest. "The child is ill, I hear. Boutron tells me she has been ill for several days from overwork in the fields. I shall go out tomorrow to see about her. I would go today if I could." "The child is ill," was all that Agenor heard or understood of Père Antoine's words. He turned and walked resolutely away, like one who determines suddenly upon action after meaningless hesitation. He walked towards his home and past it as if it were a spot that did not concern him. He went on down the lane and into the wood where he had seen Lely disappear that day. Here all was shadow, for the sun had dipped too low in the west to send a single ray through the dense foliage of the forest. Now that he had found himself on the way to Lely's home, he strove to understand why he had not gone there before. He often visited other girls in the village and neighborhood. Why not have gone to her as well? The answer lay too deep in his heart for him to be more than half conscious of it. Fear had kept him. Dread to see her desolate life face to face. He did not know how he could bear it. But now he was going to her at last. She was ill. He would stand upon that dismantled porch that he could just remember. Doubtless Mamsidor would come out to know his will, and he would tell her that Père Antoine had sent to inquire how Mademoiselle Lely was. No, why drag in Père Antoine? He would simply stand boldly and say, "Madame Zidore, I learned that Lely is ill. I have come to know if it is true, and to see her if I may." When Agenor reached the cabin where Lely dwelt, all signs of day had vanished. Dusk had fallen swiftly after the sunset. The moss that hung heavy from the great live oak branches was making fantastic silhouettes against the eastern sky that the big round moon was beginning to light. Off in the swamp beyond the bayou, hundreds of dismal voices were droning in a lullaby. Upon the hovel itself, a stillness like death rested. Oftener than once, Agenor tapped on the door, which was closed as well as it could be, without obtaining a reply. He finally approached one of the small, unglazed windows in which coarse mosquito netting had been fastened, and looked into the room. By the moonlight slanting in, he could see Lely stretched upon a bed, but of Madame Zadore there was no sign. "Lely," he called softly, "Lely." The girl slightly moved her head upon the pillow. Then he boldly opened the door and entered. Upon a wretched bed, over which was spread a cover of patched calico, Lely lay, her frail body only half concealed by the single garment which was upon it. One hand was plunged beneath her pillow, the other, which was free, he touched. It was as hot as flame, so was her head. He knelt sobbing upon the floor beside her, and called her his love and his soul. He begged her to speak a word to him, to look at him. But she only muttered disjointedly that the cotton was all turning to ashes in the fields, and blades of corn were in flames. If he was choked with love and grief to see her so, he was moved by anger as well, rage against himself, against Père Antoine, against the people upon the plantation and in the village who had so abandoned a helpless creature to misery and maybe death. Because she had been silent, had not lifted her voice in complaint, they believed she suffered no more than she could bear. But surely the people could not be utterly without heart. There must be one somewhere with a spirit of Christ. Père Antoine would tell him of such a one, and he would carry Lélie to her, out of this atmosphere of death. He was in haste to be gone with her. He fancied every moment of delay was a fresh danger threatening her life. He folded the rude bed cover over Lélie's naked limbs and lifted her in his arms. She made no resistance. She seemed only loath to withdraw her hand from beneath the pillow. When she did, he saw that she held lightly but firmly grasped in her encircling fingers the pretty Easter egg he had given her. He uttered a low cry of exultation as the full significance of this came over him. If she had hung for hours upon his neck, telling him that she loved him, he could not have known it more surely than by this sign. Agenor felt as if some mysterious bond had all at once drawn them heart to heart and made them one. No need now to go from door to door begging admittance for her. She was his. She belonged to him. He knew now where her place was, whose roof must shelter her, and whose arms protect her. So Agenor, with his loved one in his arms, walked through this forest, sure-footed as a panther. Once as he walked, he could hear in the distance the weird chant which Madame Zidore was crooning, to the moon maybe, as she gathered her wood. Once, where the water was trickling cool through rocks, he stopped to lave Lélie's hot cheeks and hands and forehead. He had not once touched his lips to her, but now, when a sudden great fear came upon him, because she did not know him, instinctively he pressed his lips upon hers that were parched and burning. He held them there till hers were soft and pliant from the healthy moisture of his own. Then she knew him. She did not tell him so, but her stiffened fingers relaxed their tense hold upon the Easter bauble. It fell to the ground as she twined her arm around his neck, and he understood. "Stay close by her, Tranquilline," said Agenor, when he had laid Lélie upon his own couch at home. "I'm going for the doctor and for Père Antoine. Not because she's going to die," he added hastily, seeing the awe that crept into the woman's face at the mention of a priest. "She is going to live. Do you think I would let my wife die, Tranquilline?" End of Love on the Bon Dieu.
The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest coneflower and as clear as crystal, it is very, very deep. So deep indeed that no cable could sound it, and many church steeples piled one upon another would not reach from the ground beneath to the surface of the water above. There dwell the Sea King and his subjects. We must not imagine that there is nothing at the bottom of the sea but bare yellow sand. No, indeed, for on this sand grow the strangest flowers and plants, the leaves and stems of which are so pliant that the slightest agitation of the water causes them to stir as if they had life. Fishes, both large and small, glide between the branches as birds fly among the trees here upon land. In the deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are built of coral, and the long Gothic windows are of the clearest amber. The roof is formed of shells that open and close as the water flows over them. Their appearance is very beautiful, for in each lies a glittering pearl, which would be fitted for the diadem of a queen. The Sea King had been a widower for many years, and his aged mother kept house for him. She was a very sensible woman, but exceedingly proud of her high birth, and on that account wore 12 oysters on her tail, while others of high rank were only allowed to wear 6. She was, however, deserving of very great praise, especially for her care of the little sea princesses, her 6 granddaughters. They were beautiful children, but the youngest was the prettiest of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose leaf, and her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like all the others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they played in the great halls of the castle, or among the living flowers that grew out of the walls. The large amber windows were open, and the fish swam in, just as the swallows fly into our houses when we opened the windows, only the fishes swam up to the princesses, ate out of their hands, and allowed themselves to be stroked. Outside the castle there was a beautiful garden, in which grew bright red and dark blue flowers, and blossoms like flames of fire. The fruit glittered like gold, and the leaves and stems waved to and fro continually. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as the flame of burning sulphur. Over everything lay a peculiar blue radiance, as if the blue sky were everywhere, above and below, instead of the dark depths of the sea. In calm weather the sun could be seen, looking like a reddish-purple flower with light streaming from the calyx. Each of the young princesses had a little plot of ground in the garden, where she might dig and plant as she pleased. One arranged her flower bed in the form of a whale, another preferred to make hers like the figure of a little mermaid, while the youngest child made hers round like the sun, and in it grew flowers as red as the rays at sunset. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful. While her sisters showed delight at the wonderful things which they obtained from the wrecks of vessels, she cared only for her pretty flowers, red like the sun, and a beautiful marble statue. It was the representation of a handsome boy, carved out of pure white stone, which had fallen to the bottom of the sea from a wreck. She planted by the statue a rose-colored weeping willow. It grew rapidly and soon hung its fresh branches over the statue, almost down to the blue sands. The shadows had the color of violet and waved to and fro like the branches, so that it seemed as if the crown of the tree and the root were at play, trying to kiss each other. Nothing gave her so much pleasure as to hear about the world above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her all she knew of the ships and of the towns, the people and the animals. To her it seemed most wonderful and beautiful to hear that the flowers of the land had fragrance, while those below the sea had none, that the trees of the forest were green, and that the fishes among the trees could sing so sweetly that it was a pleasure to listen to them. Her grandmother called the birds fishes, or the little mermaid would not have understood what was meant, for she had never seen birds. "When you have reached your 15th year," said the grandmother, "you will have permission to rise up out of the sea and sit on the rocks in the moonlight while the great ships go sailing by. Then you will see both forests and towns." In the following year, one of the sisters would be 15, but as each was a year younger than the other, the youngest would have to wait 5 years before her turn came to rise up from the bottom of the ocean to see the earth as we do. However, each promised to tell the others what she saw on her first visit and what she thought was most beautiful. Their grandmother could not tell them enough. There were so many things about which they wanted to know. None of them longed so much for her turn to come as the youngest, she who had the longest time to wait, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many nights she stood by the open window, looking up through the dark blue water, and watching the fish as they splashed about with their fins and tails. She could see the moon and stars shining faintly, but through the water they looked larger than they do to our eyes. When something like a black cloud passed between her and them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming over her head or a ship full of human beings who never imagined that a pretty little mermaid was standing beneath them, holding out her white hands towards the keel of their ship. At length the eldest was 15 and was allowed to rise to the surface of the ocean. When she returned, she had hundreds of things to talk about, but the finest thing, she said, was to lie on a sandbank in the quiet moonlit sea near the shore, gazing at the lights of the nearby town that twinkled like hundreds of stars, and listening to the sounds of music, the noise of carriages, the voices of human beings, and the merry pealing of the bells in the church steeples. Because she could not go near all these wonderful things, she longed for them all the more. Oh, how eagerly did the youngest sister listen to all these descriptions. And afterwards, when she stood at the open window, looking up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city, with all its bustle and noise, and even fancied she could hear the sound of church bells down in the depths of the sea. In another year, the second sister received permission to rise to the surface of the water and to swim about where she pleased. She rose just as the sun was setting, and this, she said, was the most beautiful sight of all. The whole sky looked like gold, and violet and rose-colored clouds, which she could not describe, drifted across it. And more swiftly than the clouds flew a large flock of wild swans toward the setting sun, like a long white veil across the sea. She also swam towards the sun, but it sank into the waves, and the rosy tints faded from the clouds and from the sea. The third sister's turn followed, and she was the boldest of them all, for she swam up a broad river that emptied into the sea. On the banks she saw green hills covered with beautiful vines, and palaces and castles peeping out from amid the proud trees of the forest. She heard birds singing and felt the rays of the sun so strongly that she was obliged often to dive under the water to cool her burning face. In a narrow creek she found a large group of little human children, almost naked, sporting about in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they fled in a great fright, and then a little black animal, it was a dog, but she did not know it, for she had never seen one before, came to the water and barked at her so furiously that she became frightened and rushed back to the open sea. But she said that she should never forget the beautiful forest, the green hills, and the pretty children who could swim in the water, although they had no tails. The fourth sister was more timid. She remained in the midst of the sea, but said it was quite as beautiful there as nearer the land. She could see many miles around her, and the sky above looked like a bell of glass. She had seen the ships, but at such a great distance that they looked like seagulls. The dolphins sported in the waves, and the great whales spouted water from their nostrils, till it seemed as if 100 fountains were playing in every direction. The fifth sister's birthday occurred in the winter, so when her turn came she saw what the others had not seen the first time they went up. The sea looked quite green, and large icebergs were floating about, each like a pearl, she said, but larger and loftier than the churches built by men. They were of the most singular shapes and glittered like diamonds. She had seated herself on one of the largest and let the wind play with her long hair. She noticed that all the ships sailed past very rapidly, steering as far away as they could, as if they were afraid of the iceberg. Towards evening, as the sun went down, dark clouds covered the sky, the thunder rolled, and the flashes of lightning glowed red on the icebergs as they were tossed about by the heaving sea. On all the ships the sails were reefed with fear and trembling, while she sat on the floating iceberg, calmly watching the lightning as it darted its forked flashes into the sea. Each of the sisters, when first she had permission to rise to the surface, was delighted with the new and beautiful sights. Now that they were grown-up girls and could go where they pleased, they had become quite indifferent about it. They soon wished themselves back again, and after a month had passed they said it was much more beautiful down below and pleasanter to be at home. Yet often in the evening hours the 5 sisters would twine their arms about each other and rise to the surface together. Their voices were more charming than that of any human being, and before the approach of a storm, when they feared that a ship might be lost, they swam before the vessel, singing enchanting songs of the delights to be found in the depths of the sea, and begging the voyagers not to fear if they sank to the bottom. But the sailors could not understand the song, and thought it was the sighing of the storm. These things were never beautiful to them, for if the ship sank, the men were drowned, and their dead bodies alone reached the palace of the Sea King. When the sisters rose, arm in arm through the water, their youngest sister would stand quite alone, looking after them, ready to cry. Only, since mermaids have no tears, she suffered more acutely. "Oh, were I but 15 years old," said she, "I know that I shall love the world up there, and all the people who live in it." At last she reached her 15th year. "Well, now you are grown up," said the old dowager, her grandmother. "Come, let me adorn you like your sisters." And she placed in her hair a wreath of white lilies, of which every flower leaf was half a pearl. Then the old lady ordered 8 great oysters to attach themselves to the tail of the princess to show her high rank. "But they hurt me so," said the little mermaid. "Yes, I know. Pride must suffer pain," replied the old lady. Oh, how gladly she would have shaken off all this grandeur and laid aside the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her own garden would have suited her much better, but she could not change herself, so she said farewell and rose as lightly as a bubble to the surface of the water. The sun had just set when she raised her head above the waves. The clouds were tinted with crimson and gold, and through the glimmering twilight beamed the evening star in all its beauty. The sea was calm and the air mild and fresh. A large ship with 3 masts lay becalmed on the water. Only one sail was set, for not a breeze stirred, and the sailors sat idle on the deck or amidst the rigging. There was music and song on board, and as darkness came on, 100-colored lanterns were lighted, as if the flags of all nations waved in the air. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin windows, and now and then, as the waves lifted her up, she could look in through the glass window panes and see a number of gaily dressed people. Among them, and the most beautiful of all, was a young prince with large black eyes. He was 16 years of age, and his birthday was being celebrated with great display. The sailors were dancing on deck, and when the prince came out of the cabin, more than 100 rockets rose in the air, making it as bright as day. The little mermaid was so startled that she dived under water, and when she again stretched out her head, it looked as if all the stars of heaven were falling around her. She had never seen such fireworks before. Great suns spurted fire about, splendid fireflies flew into the blue air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea beneath. The ship itself was so brightly illuminated that all the people, and even the smallest rope, could be distinctly seen. How handsome the young prince looked as he pressed the hands of all his guests, and smiled at them while the music resounded through the clear night air. It was very late, yet the little mermaid could not take her eyes from the ship or from the beautiful prince. The colored lanterns had been extinguished, no more rockets rose in the air, and the cannon had ceased firing, but the sea became restless, and a moaning, grumbling sound could be heard beneath the waves. Still the little mermaid remained by the cabin window, rocking up and down on the water so that she could look within. After a while the sails were quickly set, and the ship went on her way. But soon the waves rose higher, heavy clouds darkened the sky, and lightning appeared in the distance. A dreadful storm was approaching. Once more the sails were furled, and the great ship pursued her flying course over the raging sea. The waves rose mountain high as if they would overtop the mast, but the ship dived like a swan beneath them, then rose again on their lofty foaming crests. To the little mermaid this was pleasant sport, but not so to the sailors. At length the ship groaned and creaked. The thick planks gave way under the lashing of the sea as the waves broke over the deck, The mainmast snapped asunder like a reed, and as the ship lay over on her side, the water rushed in. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew were in danger. Even she was obliged to be careful, to avoid the beams and planks of the wreck which lay scattered on the water. At one moment it was pitch dark so that she could not see a single object, but when a flash of lightning came, it revealed the whole scene. She could see everyone who had been on board except the prince. When the ship parted, she had seen him sink into the deep waves, and she was glad, for she thought he would now be with her. Then she remembered that human beings could not live in the water, so that when he got down to her father's palace, he would certainly be quite dead. No, he must not die. So she swam about among the beams and planks which strewed the surface of the sea, forgetting that they could crush her to pieces. Diving deep under the dark waters, rising and falling with the waves, she at length managed to reach the young prince, who was fast losing the power to swim in that stormy sea. His limbs were failing him, his beautiful eyes were closed, and he would have died had not the little mermaid come to his assistance. She held his head above the water and let the waves carry them where they would. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun came up red and shining out of the water, and its beams brought back the hue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He seemed to her like the marble statue in her little garden, so she kissed him again and wished that he might live. Presently they came in sight of land, and she saw lofty blue mountains, on which the white snow rested as if a flock of swans were lying upon them. Beautiful green forests were near the shore, and close by stood a large building, whether a church or a convent she could not tell. Orange and citron trees grew in the garden, and before the door stood lofty palms. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water lay quiet and still, but very deep. She swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine, taking care to raise his head higher than his body. Then bells sounded in the large white building, and some young girls came into the garden. The little mermaid swam out farther from the shore and hid herself among some high rocks that rose out of the water. Covering her head and neck with the foam of the sea, she watched there to see what would become of the poor prince. It was not long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where the prince lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment. Then she brought a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came to life again and smiled upon those who stood about him. But to her he sent no smile. He knew not that she had saved him. This made her very sorrowful, and when he was led away into the great building, she dived down into the water and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface of the water, but she could tell them nothing. Many an evening and morning did she rise to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen and watched them gathered. She watched the snow on the mountain tops melt away, but never did she see the prince, and therefore she always returned home more sorrowful than before. It was her only comfort to sit in her own little garden and fling her arms around the beautiful marble statue, which was like the prince. She gave up tending her flowers, and they grew in wild confusion over the paths, twining their long leaves and stems round the branches of the trees, so that the whole place became dark and gloomy. At length she could bear it no longer, and told one of her sisters all about it. Then the others heard the secret, and very soon it became known to several mermaids, one of whom had an intimate friend who happened to know about the prince. She had also seen the festival on board ship, and she told them where the prince came from and where his palace stood. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses. Then they entwined their arms and rose together to the surface of the water, near the spot where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of bright yellow, shining stone, and had long flights of marble steps, one of which reached quite down to the sea. Splendid gilded cupolas rose over the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the whole building stood lifeless statues of marble. Through the clear crystal of the lofty windows could be seen noble rooms with costly silk curtains and hangings of tapestry and walls covered with beautiful paintings. In the center of the largest salon, a fountain threw its sparkling jets high up into the glass cupola of the ceiling, through which the sun shone upon the water and upon the beautiful plants that grew in the basin of the fountain. Now that the little mermaid knew where the prince lived, she spent many an evening and many a night on the water near the palace. She would swim much nearer the shore than any of the others had ventured, and once she went up the narrow channel under the marble balcony, which threw a broad shadow on the water. Here she sat and watched the young prince, who thought himself alone in the bright moonlight. She often saw him evenings, sailing in a beautiful boat on which music sounded and flags waved. She peeped out from among the green rushes, as if the wind caught her long silvery white veil. Those who saw it believed it to be a swan spreading out its wings. Many a night, too, when the fishermen set their nets by the light of their torches, she heard them relate many good things about the young prince, and this made her glad that she had saved his life when he was tossed about, half dead on the waves. She remembered how his head had rested on her bosom and how heartily she had kissed him, but he knew nothing of all this and could not even dream of her. She grew more and more to like human beings and wished more and more to be able to wander about with those whose worlds seemed to be so much larger than her own. They could fly over the sea in ships and mount the high hills which were far above the clouds, and the lands they possessed, their woods and their fields, stretched far away beyond the reach of her sight. There was so much that she wished to know, but her sisters were unable to answer all her questions. She then went to her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, which she rightly called the lands above the sea. "If human beings are not drowned," asked the little mermaid, "can they live forever? Do they never die as we do here in the sea?" "Yes," replied the old lady, "they must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live for 300 years, but when we cease to exist here, we become only foam on the surface of the water and have not even a grave among those we love. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again. Like the green seaweed, when once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have souls which live forever, even after the body has been turned to dust. They rise up through the clear, pure air, beyond the glittering stars. As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions, which we shall never see." "Why have we not immortal souls?" asked the little mermaid mournfully. "I would gladly give all the hundreds of years that I have to live, to be a human being only for one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of that glorious world above the stars." "You must not think that," said the old woman. "We believe that we are much happier and much better off than human beings." "So I shall die," said the little mermaid, "and as the foam of the sea I shall be driven about, never again to hear the music of the waves, or to see the pretty flowers, or the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul?" "No," said the old woman, "unless a man should love you so much that you were more to him than his father or his mother, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be true to you here and hereafter, then his soul would glide into your body, and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind. He would give you a soul and retain his own as well. But this can never happen. Your fish's tail, which among us is considered so beautiful, on earth is thought to be quite ugly. They do not know any better, and they think it necessary, in order to be handsome, to have 2 stout props, which they call legs." Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowfully at her fish's tail. "Let us be happy," said the old lady, "and dart and spring about during the 300 years that we have to live, which is really quite long enough. After that, we can rest ourselves all the better. This evening we are going to have a court ball." It was one of those splendid sights which we can never see on earth. The walls and the ceilings of the large ballroom were of thick but transparent crystal. Many hundreds of colossal shells, some of a deep red and the others of a grass green, with blue fire in them, stood in rows on each side. These lighted up the whole salon and shone through the walls so that the sea was also illuminated. Innumerable fishes, great and small, swam past the crystal walls. On some of them the scales glowed with a purple brilliance, and on others shone like silver and gold. Through the halls flowed a broad stream, and in it danced the mermen and the mermaids to the music of their own sweet singing. No one on earth has such lovely voices as they, but the little mermaid sang more sweetly than all. The whole court applauded her with hands and tails, and for a moment her heart felt quite gay, for she knew she had the sweetest voice either on earth or in sea. But soon she thought again of the world above her, and she could not forget the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she had not an immortal soul like his. She crept away silently out of her father's palace, and while everything within was gladness and song, she sat in her own little garden, sorrowful and alone. Then she heard the bugle sounding through the water, and thought, "He is certainly sailing above, he in whom my wishes center, and in whose hands I should like to place the happiness of my life. I will venture all for him, and to win an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing in my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch, of which I have always been so afraid. She can give me counsel and help." Then the little mermaid went out from her garden and took the road to the foaming whirlpools beyond which the sorceress lived. She had never been that way before. Neither flowers nor grass grew there. Nothing but bare, gray, sandy ground stretched out to the whirlpool, where the water, like foaming mill wheels, seized everything that came within its reach and cast it into the fathomless deep. Through the midst of these crushing whirlpools, the little mermaid was obliged to pass before she could reach the dominions of the sea witch. Then for a long distance the road lay across a stretch of warm, bubbling mire, called by the witch her turf moor. Beyond this was the witch's house, which stood in the center of a strange forest, where all the trees and flowers were polypi, half animals and half plants. They looked like serpents with 100 heads growing out of the ground. The branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like flexible worms, moving limb after limb from the root to the top. All that could be reached in the sea they seized upon and held fast, so that it never escaped from their clutches. The little mermaid was so alarmed at what she saw that she stood still, and her heart beat with fear. She came very near turning back, but she thought of the prince and of the human soul for which she longed, and her courage returned. She fastened her long flowing hair around her head so that the polypi should not lay hold of it. She crossed her hands on her bosom and then darted forward as a fish shoots through the water, between the supple arms and fingers of the ugly polypi, which were stretched out on each side of her. She saw that they all held in their grasp something they had seized with their numerous little arms, which were as strong as iron bands. Tightly grasped in their clinging arms were white skeletons of human beings who had perished at sea and had sunk down into the deep waters. Skeletons of land animals, and oars, rudders, and chests of ships. There was even a little mermaid whom they had caught and strangled, and this seemed the most shocking of all to the little princess. Now she came to a space of marshy ground in the wood, where large fat water snakes were rolling in the mire and showing their ugly drab-colored bodies. In the midst of this spot stood a house built of the bones of shipwrecked human beings. There sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as people sometimes feed a canary with pieces of sugar. She called the ugly water snakes her little chickens and allowed them to crawl all over her bosom. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. "It is very stupid of you, but you shall have your way, though it will bring you to sorrow, my pretty princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail and to have two supports instead, like human beings on earth, so that the young prince may fall in love with you and so that you may have an immortal soul." And the witch laughed so loud and so disgustingly that the toad and the snakes fell to the ground and lay there wriggling. "You are but just in time," said the witch, "for after sunrise tomorrow I should not be able to help you till the end of another year. I will prepare a draught for you, with which you must swim to land tomorrow before sunrise. Seat yourself there and drink it. Your tail will then disappear and shrink up into what men call legs. You will feel great pain as if a sword were passing through you, but all who see you will say that you are the prettiest little human being they ever saw. You will still have the same floating gracefulness of movements, and no dancer will ever tread so lightly. Every step you take, however, will be as if you were treading upon sharp knives, and as if the blood must flow. If you will bear all this, I will help you." "Yes, I will," said the little princess in a trembling voice, as she thought of the prince and the immortal soul. "But think again," said the witch, "for when once your shape has become like a human being, you can no more be a mermaid. You will never return through the water to your sisters or to your father's palace again. And if you do not win the love of the prince, so that he is willing to forget his father and mother for your sake, and to love you with his whole soul, and allow the priest to join your hands, that you may be man and wife, then you will never have an immortal soul. The first morning after he marries another, your heart will break, and you will become foam on the crest of the waves." "I will do it," said the little mermaid, and she became pale as death. "But I must be paid also," said the witch, "and it is not a trifle that I ask. You have the sweetest voice of any who dwell here in the depths of the sea, and you believe that you will be able to charm the prince with it. But this voice you must give to me. The best thing you possess will I have as the price of my costly draught, which must be mixed with my own blood so that it may be as sharp as a two-edged sword." "But if you take away my voice," said the little mermaid, "what is left for me?" "Your beautiful form, your graceful walk, and your expressive eyes. Surely with these you can enchain a man's heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Put out your little tongue, that I may cut it off as my payment. Then you shall have the powerful draught." "It shall be," said the little mermaid. Then the witch placed her cauldron on the fire to prepare the magic draught. "Cleanliness is a good thing," she said, scouring the vessel with snakes which she had tied together in a large knot. Then she pricked herself in the breast and let the black blood drop into the cauldron. The steam that rose twisted itself into such horrible shapes that no one could look at them without fear. Every moment the witch threw a new ingredient into the vessel, and when it began to boil, the sound was like the weeping of a crocodile. When at last the magic draught was ready, it looked like the clearest water. "There it is for you," said the witch. Then she cut off the mermaid's tongue so that she would never again speak or sing. "If the polypi should seize you as you return through the wood," said the witch, "throw over them a few drops of the potion, and their fingers will be torn into 1,000 pieces." But the little mermaid had no occasion to do this, for the polypi sprang back in terror when they caught sight of the glittering draught, which shone in her hand like a twinkling star. So she passed quickly through the wood and the marsh, and between the rushing whirlpools. She saw that in her father's palace the torches in the ballroom were extinguished, and that all within were asleep. But she did not venture to go in to them, for now that she was dumb and going to leave them forever, she felt as if her heart would break. She stole into the garden, took a flower from the flower bed of each of her sisters, kissed her hand towards the palace 1,000 times, and then rose up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not risen when she came in sight of the prince's palace and approached the beautiful marble steps, but the moon shone clear and bright. Then the little mermaid drank the magic draught. and it seemed as if the two-edged sword went through her delicate body. She fell into a swoon and lay like one dead. When the sun rose and shone over the sea, she recovered and felt a sharp pain. But before her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his coal-black eyes upon her so earnestly that she cast down her own, and then became aware that her fish's tail was gone, and that she had as pretty a pair of white legs and tiny feet as any little maiden could have. But she had no clothes, so she wrapped herself in her long, thick hair. The prince asked her who she was and whence she came. She looked at him mildly and sorrowfully with her deep blue eyes, but could not speak. He took her by the hand and led her to the palace. Every step she took was as the witch had said it would be. She felt as if she were treading upon the points of needles or sharp knives. She bore it willingly, however, and moved at the prince's side as lightly as a bubble, so that he and all who saw her wondered at her graceful swaying movements. She was very soon arrayed in costly robes of silk and muslin, and was the most beautiful creature in the palace. But she was dumb, and could neither speak nor sing. Beautiful female slaves, dressed in silk and gold, stepped forward and sang before the prince and his royal parents. One sang better than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This was a great sorrow to the little mermaid, for she knew how much more sweetly she herself once could sing, and she thought, "Oh, if he could only know that I have given away my voice forever to be with him." The slaves next performed some pretty fairy-like dances to the sound of beautiful music. Then the little mermaid raised her lovely white arms, stood on the tips of her toes, glided over the floor, and danced as no one yet had been able to dance. At each moment her beauty was more revealed, and her expressive eyes appealed more directly to the heart than the songs of the slaves. Everyone was enchanted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling. She danced again quite readily to please him, though each time her foot touched the floor it seemed as if she trod on sharp knives. The prince said she should remain with him always, and she was given permission to sleep at his door on a velvet cushion. He had a page's dress made for her, that she might accompany him on horseback. They rode together through the sweet-scented woods, where the green boughs touched their shoulders, and the little birds sang among the fresh leaves. She climbed with him to the tops of high mountains, and although her tender feet bled so that even her steps were marked, she only smiled and followed him till they could see the clouds beneath them like a flock of birds flying to distant lands. While at the prince's palace, and when all the household were asleep, she would go and sit on the broad marble steps, for it eased her burning feet to bathe them in the cold sea water. It was then that she thought of all those below in the deep. Once during the night her sisters came up arm in arm, singing sorrowfully as they floated on the water. She beckoned to them, and they recognized her, and told her how she had grieved them. After that they came to the same place every night. Once she saw in the distance her old grandmother, who had not been to the surface of the sea for many years, and the old sea king, her father, with his crown on his head. They stretched out their hands towards her, but did not venture so near the land as her sisters had. As the days passed, she loved the prince more dearly, and he loved her as one would love a little child. The thought never came to him to make her his wife. Yet, unless he married her, she could not receive an immortal soul, and on the morning after his marriage with another, she would dissolve into the foam of the sea. "Do you not love me the best of them all?" the eyes of the little mermaid seemed to say when he took her in his arms and kissed her fair forehead. "Yes, you are dear to me," said the prince, "for you have the best heart, and you are the most devoted to me. You were like a young maiden whom I once saw, but whom I shall never meet again. I was in a ship that was wrecked, and the waves cast me ashore near the holy temple, where several young maidens performed the service. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her but twice, and she is the only one in the world whom I could love. But you are like her, and you have almost driven her image from my mind. She belongs to the holy temple, and good fortune has sent you to me in her stead. We will never part." "Ah, he knows not that it was I who saved his life," thought the little mermaid. "I carried him over the sea to the wood where the temple stands. I sat beneath the foam and watched till the human beings came to help him. I saw the pretty maiden that he loves better than he loves me." The mermaid sighed deeply, but she could not weep. "He says the maiden belongs to the holy temple. Therefore she will never return to the world. They will meet no more. I am by his side and see him every day. I will take care of him and love him and give up my life for his sake." Very soon it was said that the prince was to marry, and that the beautiful daughter of the neighboring king would be his wife, for a fine ship was being fitted out. Although the prince gave out that he intended merely to pay a visit to the king, it was generally supposed that he went to court the princess. A great company were to go with him. The little mermaid smiled and shook her head. She knew the prince's thoughts better than any of the others. "I must travel," he had said to her. "I must see this beautiful princess. My parents desire it, but they will not oblige me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her, because she is not like the beautiful maiden in the temple whom you resemble. If I were forced to choose a bride, I would choose you, my dumb foundling, with those expressive eyes." Then he kissed her rosy mouth, played with her long waving hair, and laid his head on her heart, while she dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. "You are not afraid of the sea, my dumb child, are you?" he said, as they stood on the deck of the noble ship which was to carry them to the country of the neighboring king. Then he told her of storm and of calm, of strange fishes in the deep beneath them, and of what the divers had seen there. She smiled at his descriptions, for she knew better than anyone what wonders were at the bottom of the sea. In the moonlight night, when all on board were asleep except the man at the helm, she sat on the deck, gazing down through the clear water. She thought she could distinguish her father's castle, and upon it her aged grandmother, with the silver crown on her head, looking through the rushing tide at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters came up on the waves and gazed at her mournfully, wringing their white hands. She beckoned to them and smiled and wanted to tell them how happy and well off she was. But the cabin boy approached, and when the sisters dived down, he thought what he saw was only the foam of the sea. The next morning the ship sailed into the harbor of the beautiful town belonging to the king whom the prince was going to visit. The church bells were ringing, and from the high towers sounded a flourish of trumpets. Soldiers with flying colors and glittering bayonets lined the roads through which they passed. Every day was a festival, balls and entertainments following one another. But the princess had not yet appeared. People said that she had been brought up and educated in a religious house where she was learning every royal virtue. At last she came. Then the little mermaid, who was anxious to see whether she was really beautiful, was obliged to admit that she had never seen a more perfect vision of beauty. Her skin was delicately fair, and beneath her long dark eyelashes her laughing blue eyes shone with truth and purity. "It was you," said the prince, "who saved my life when I lay as if dead on the beach," and he folded his blushing bride in his arms. "Oh, I am too happy," said he to the little mermaid. "My fondest hopes are now fulfilled. You will rejoice in my happiness, for your devotion to me is great and sincere." The little mermaid kissed his hand and felt as if her heart were already broken. His wedding morning would bring death to her, and she would change into the foam of the sea. All the church bells rang, and the heralds rode through the town proclaiming the betrothal. Perfumed oil was burned in costly silver lamps on every altar. The priests waved the censers, while the bride and the bridegroom joined their hands and received the blessing of the bishop. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held up the bride's train, but her ears heard nothing of the festive music, and her eyes saw not the holy ceremony. She thought of the night of death which was coming to her, and of all she had lost in the world. On the same evening, the bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. Cannons were roaring, flags waving, and in the center of the ship a costly tent of purple and gold had been erected. It contained elegant sleeping couches for the bridal pair during the night. The ship, under a favorable wind, with swelling sails, glided away smoothly and lightly over the calm sea. When it grew dark, a number of colored lamps were lighted, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of her first rising out of the sea, when she had seen similar joyful festivals, so she too joined in the dance, poised herself in the air as a swallow when he pursues his prey, and all present cheered her wonderingly. She had never danced so gracefully before. Her tender feet felt as if cut with sharp knives, but she cared not for the pain. A sharper pang had pierced her heart. She knew this was the last evening she should ever see the prince for whom she had forsaken her kindred and her home. She had given up her beautiful voice and suffered unheard of pain daily for him, while he knew nothing of it. This was the last evening that she should breathe the same air with him, or gaze on the starry sky and the deep sea. An eternal night without a thought or a dream awaited her. She had no soul, and now could never win one. All was joy and gaiety on the ship until long after midnight. She smiled and danced with the rest, while the thought of death was in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, and she played with his raven hair till they went arm in arm to rest in the sumptuous tent. Then all became still on board the ship, and only the pilot, who stood at the helm, was awake. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the edge of the vessel and looked towards the east for the first blush of morning, for that first ray of the dawn which was to be her death. She saw her sisters rising out of the flood. They were as pale as she, but their beautiful hair no longer waved in the wind. It had been cut off. "We have given our hair to the witch," said they, "to obtain help for you, that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again into a fish's tail, and you will once more be a mermaid, and can return to us to live out your 300 years, before you are changed into the salt sea foam. Haste then, either he or you must die before sunrise. Our old grandmother mourned so for you that her white hair is falling, as ours fell under the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hasten! Do you not see the first red streaks in the sky? In a few minutes the sun will rise, and you must die." Then they sighed deeply and mournfully, and sank beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the tent and beheld the fair bride, whose head was resting on the prince's breast. She bent down and kissed his noble brow, then looked at the sky, on which the rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter. She glanced at the sharp knife, and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who whispered the name of his bride in his dreams. She was in his thoughts, and the knife trembled in the hand of the little mermaid, but she flung it far from her into the waves. The water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted up looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half-fainting glance at the prince, then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and felt her body dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and his warm rays fell on the cold foam of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun and hundreds of transparent, beautiful creatures floating around her. She could see through them the white sails of the ships and the red clouds of the sky. Their speech was melodious, but could not be heard by mortal ears, just as their bodies could not be seen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and that she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and her voice sounded ethereal, like the voices of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. "Among the daughters of the air," answered one of them. "A mermaid has not an immortal soul, nor can she obtain one unless she wins the love of a human being. On the will of another hangs her eternal destiny. But the daughters of the air, although they do not possess an immortal soul, can by their good deeds procure one for themselves. We fly to warm countries and cool the sultry air that destroys mankind with the pestilence. We carry the perfume of the flowers to spread health and restoration. After we have striven for 300 years to do all the good in our power, we receive an immortal soul and take part in the happiness of mankind. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with your whole heart to do as we are doing. You have suffered and endured and raised yourself to the spirit world by your good deeds, and now, by striving for 300 years in the same way, you may obtain an immortal soul. The little mermaid lifted her glorified eyes toward the sun, and for the first time felt them filling with tears. On the ship in which she had left the prince there was life and noise, and she saw him and his beautiful bride searching for her. Sorrowfully they gazed at the pearly foam, as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the forehead of the bride and fanned the prince, and then mounted with the other children of the air to a rosy cloud that floated above. After 300 years, she said, "Thus shall we float into the kingdom of heaven," said she. "And we may even get there sooner," whispered one of her companions. "Unseen, we can enter the houses of men where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child that is the joy of his parents and deserves their love, our time of probation is shortened. The child does not know, when we fly through the room, that we smile with joy at his good conduct, for we can count 1 year less of our 300 years. But when we see a naughty or a wicked child, we shed tears of sorrow, and for every tear a day is added to our time of trial." End of The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen.
The knowledge of Christ's love. It is the distinguishing mark of God's people that they know the love of Christ. Without exception, all those who have passed from death unto life, whatever they may not know, have learned this, and without exception all those who are not saved, whatever they may know, besides, knowing nothing of this. For to know the love of Christ, to taste its sweetness, to realize it personally, experimentally, and vitally, as shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, is the privilege of the child of God alone. This is the secure enclosure into which the stranger cannot enter. This is the garden of the Lord, so well protected by walls and hedges that no wild boar of the wood can enter. Only the redeemed of the Lord shall walk here. They, and only they, may pluck the fruits and content themselves with the delights thereof. How important then becomes the question, do I know the love of Christ? Have I felt it? Do I understand it? Is it shed abroad in my heart? Do I know that Jesus loves me? Is my heart quickened and animated and warmed and attracted towards him through the great truth that it recognizes and rejoices in, that Christ has really loved me and chosen me and set his heart upon me? But while it is true that every child of God knows the love of Christ, it is equally true that all the children of God do not know this love to the same extent. They are in Christ's family, babes, young men, strong men, and fathers, and as they grow and progress in all other matters, so they most certainly make advances here. Indeed, an increase of love, a more perfect apprehension of Christ's love, is one of the best and most infallible gauges whereby we may test ourselves whether we have grown in grace or not. If we have grown in grace, it is absolutely certain that we shall have advanced in our knowledge and reciprocation of the love of Christ. Many have believed in Jesus and know a little of his love, but oh, it is little indeed they know in comparison with some others who have been brought into the inner chamber and made to drink of the spiced wine of Christ's pomegranate. Some have begun to climb the mountain, and the view which lies at their feet is lovely and passing fair, but the landscape is not such as would greet their eyes if they could but stand where advanced saints are standing, and could look to the east and to the west, to the north and to the south, and see all the lengths and breadths and depths and heights of the love of Christ, which passes knowledge. End of The Knowledge of Christ's Love by Charles Haddon Spurgeon.